Well, welcome everyone to the 2022 Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Convention. I'm Priscilla Rader Kolb, the Senior Law School Programs Attorney for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I'm so delighted that you're here. I want to extend a thank you to everyone for complying with our safety measures so we're all able to be here comfortable and safely. It has been a very challenging few years. I acknowledge that, but in that time, I've personally witnessed so much compassion, empowerment, and continued motivation within this movement. And it's an honor to be here with all of you today. The student convention started in 2017 as a way to celebrate our student chapters and law students from across the country, while also providing a unique opportunity to allow you to meet with experts and get to know each other before the very hectic conference weekend begins. It goes by in like a blink of an eye sometimes. While we have been virtual the last 2 years, I am curious to know who's attending the student convention and the Animal Law Conference for the very first time, virtual or in person. Wow, so many of you. Well, welcome. This is my 12th conference. I am so happy that we're back in person, that we're able to do this. And I did want to get to know all of you a little bit better. So how many 1Ls do we have? Quite a few. Thank you so much for being here, especially in your first semester. Hope it's going well. And how many 2Ls? Perfect, quite a few. And 3Ls, getting ready to graduate. Wonderful, all back there. And 4L evening or LLM students out there, you guys are incredible. Perfect. Any non-legal students, so undergrad or masters? You? And any special guests here with us? Perfect. Well, welcome. No matter where you are on your journey within animal law, we're so excited to have you here with us today. And I hope that this weekend brings you that compassion, empowerment, and continued motivation to take with you for the next year to come. Today, we'll hear from experts in animal law with a special focus on farmed animal advocacy. And we'll hear from students who participated in the Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Scholars Workshop, where 5 talented and committed students spent this last year researching, drafting, and editing papers that will be published in a forthcoming special volume. And the call for proposals was on farmed animals and natural disasters. We'll hear more from them before and after lunch, and I thank you for participating. To kick things off, sorry, I'll stay close to the mic. To kick things off, we'll start with the Careers in Farmed Animal Advocacy panel with myself moderating. This panel is highly reliant on questions from all of you, so please don't be shy. We'll ask that you go to the mics on either side and queue in line. If you can, please say your name and the school you attend before asking a question. If you are virtual, we are taking virtual questions as well, and welcome. We're so excited that you're able to join us from wherever you are. Questions can be on anything from curriculum planning to what it's like to work in animal law. It can also include specifically tailored questions for farm animal advocacy and what it's like to work in farm animal protection, as a lot of our panelists today have either done that work or are doing that work currently. Before that, I did want to give a chance for our panelists to provide some highlights of their own and to introduce themselves in their own words. I think that's a little bit more fun and interesting for all of you. I will provide just names and titles so we can get there, get things started. So we're pleased to have with us Piper Hoffman, Senior Director of Legal Advocacy at Animal Outlook. Brian Hackett, Legislative Affairs Manager at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Leah Garces, President of Mercy for Animals. Christina Stella, Managing Attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Litigation Program. And Jamie McLaughlin, LLM candidate and ALDF Student Scholars Workshop participant at Lewis and Clark Law School. Thank you so much for joining us. Piper, would you like to start off with a brief introduction to your work?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Piper Hoffman. I am the head of legal advocacy at Animal Outlook. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nationwide nonprofit farmed animal advocacy organization. We are vegan, we are abolitionist, and being a legal advocate while publicly taking that stance is really fun. So to tell you a little bit about, and Animal Outlook has 3 classes of interns every year, spring, summer, and fall. We are making our spring offers right now, but we haven't even posted summer yet. So how did I get here? An important question that I asked myself when I was starting out in my career was, what am I good at? What are my strengths? Like, what are the things that I can do without breaking too much of a sweat and still be pretty good? And that led me to litigation. At the time, I was actually, this was in the 90s, I was feeling like if I could choose anything to do right now, I would really like to do legislation. Because there's just such an absence of statutes to protect animals. But if you talk with me for any amount of time, and then you talk with Brian Hackett for any amount of time, you'll see why I am not good at that. That the lobbying was not a good idea for me. So I interned at ALDF in law school. After my clerkship, I went back to ALDF. And then for a number of reasons, including I moved to New York, I left ALDF and I wound up working in civil rights. So I specialized in sex discrimination class actions against Morgan Stanley and Smith Barney and these mega banks that was fun too. So I thought I was kind of biding my time and doing like my second choice, but as it happens, all of that has been so helpful to me. I have litigation knowledge and experience that few people in this movement have, and it's useful to be able to understand other tools and what the pros and cons might be of using those tools for animals. And I jotted down a couple things that like I would have liked to have heard when I was where you are now. So one thing is that I had everything planned. Nothing went that way. And I heard that when I was a student. I just knew I was different. I wasn't. So what I recommend when your career winds up somewhere a little different than what you thought, it doesn't mean you can't get back to animal law. And in fact, I encourage you, no matter what it is you're getting paid for, always be doing something for the animals, for yourself, psychologically, emotionally, but also for your career. That is how you keep a toe in, you stay current, and most importantly, that's how you get to know people. And the other thing that I would think about is that where we are now, lawyers with whatever lawyerly skills and experience you have, we need you all. So in-house, corporate counsel, general counsel type of work, if you're not like get up on your feet and talk kind of person, we absolutely need you. No matter where it is you go and what skills you develop, you can help the animals. Thanks.
Thank you. And Brian?
Good morning, everyone. And that is precisely why we want Piper on any coalition that we put together for legislation. So I really wish I had ALDF and events like this. I wish I had the knowledge and awareness of these types of resources when I was interested in a career in animal protection. And as a child, I knew I wanted to do something with animals, but what the guidance counselors always said was, well, do you want to be a veterinarian? And I was like, no, surgeries and, I feel like I'm doing that now with 18 rescue animals at home. I feel like I'm an animal nurse already anyway, but no, I did not want to be a veterinarian. So I wasn't really aware of anything else to do. And so I went into politics, and I went into campaigns and consulting and management and policy and all of that. And I did that for a good period of time. And it got to a point where I said to myself, I'm doing good work. I'm working for decent people most of the time. And I said, I really want to do something more meaningful and something where I could apply the networking and the contacts and those skills that take into account in a winning campaign or a successful political candidate. And I want to apply that to advancing protections for animals. And so my Reader's Digest version of my story is I looked at my partner and I said, can you float us for 3 months? And he said, sure. What the hell are you doing? And I said, well, I'm quitting and I'm going to work in animal welfare. And so I just sat and perused National Animal Protection website employment pages. And I saw an opening for the New Jersey State Director for the Humane Society of the United States. And I looked at the job description and I said, this fits a lot of my skills and experience, but I've never worked in an animal shelter. I've never worked in animal welfare. I'm a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian, not vegan yet at the time. I had rescued cats, but I'm not going to get this job. I don't have the experience in the specific line of work. But I said, I'm going to apply for it anyway, not knowing anybody really in the field. I applied and the rest is history. When I interviewed on my first day, my partner had found a box of bottle baby kittens that were at a warehouse near his office. And so I literally went into my first interview in animal protection and I said, I got to get the hell out of here and bottle feed kittens. And I'm not making that up to look good on this interview. And so that was my foray into it. And I spent a good amount of time there, and I transitioned over to the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Really impressed with ALDF's work and mission and caliber of staff. And I transitioned over into legislative affairs here. And I have always been one to build bridges and always be willing to build those bridges and cross them and only burn them if absolutely necessary. And building coalitions and building bridges to expand the sphere of support and awareness for animal protection and the fact that they deserve protection from harm and suffering. And that's important. And sometimes, Piper alluded to this, in my job, I have to sit down with folks that are on the opposite side of the table, that are diametrically opposed to all of our values and morals and ethics, what drives us to do what we're doing in our field for animals. But you know what, if it means that we can get incremental progress to reduce suffering and make advancements, I'm going to do it, and we're going to make advancements for that. So in this panel, I'll conclude my remarks just by saying the timing couldn't have been more fitting and opportune. We have an expansive coalition in New Jersey for banning the cruel intensive confinement of sows and veal calves. Piper and a number of other folks up here, their organizations are on the coalition. And we were able to strike a compromise after over a decade for this bill. It got national attention 10 years ago when then Governor Christie was running in a Republican primary, and much of the speculation at the time was he vetoed the bill twice to protect pigs and calves because he was running in an Iowa caucus that year for the primary. And this bill has been lingering ever since. And so we struck a compromise. We're really comfortable with strong language. The bill passed Senate committee unanimously yesterday. And I believe it's the first time we've ever gotten a state farm bureau on the record supporting legislation to stop intensive confinement of animals. So thank you to everybody on the coalition and the support there. It's not a perfect piece of legislation. It's not all that we would want, but it's an example of when you build bridges, you build coalitions, you get to appropriate compromise, you can really make great strides for animals incrementally over time. So thank you all for being here. It's very exciting. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So if you listen to that and thought, I do not want to build bridges, I do not want to talk reasonably with the other side, I want to burn their house down, come talk to me.
Right. Okay. My name is Leah Garces, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the CEO and president of Mercy for Animals. And for those of you who don't know Mercy for Animals, we focus exclusively on farmed animals, and we have 6 offices globally. So in the US, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, India, Hong Kong, and we're looking to open in Singapore. We have about 200, we're getting close to 200 staff globally. And we've grown tremendously. So we were started by a 15-year-old who started it as a club 23 years ago and saw things in his hometown and didn't like them and started advocating and campaigning and raising awareness. And this just grew and grew and grew. Probably Mercy for Animals is most known for our undercover investigations. We do a lot of those. We've done 100 in our history, around 100 and about 50 drone, but we do a lot more than that. And we have a big legal team, and there's some of them are about little less than half of them, a little more than half of them are sitting right at this table. So raise your hands so they know who you are. There we go. They're amazing. I am not a lawyer. Don't ask me any legal questions because all I'm going to do is ask Jody, who's our general counsel. But I can tell you how our legal team is essential to advocating for farmed animals and having impact. I started off as someone caring about animals, and very much like you was told to be a vet, that was like the obvious career path. I did a zoology undergraduate degree at University of Florida. And at the end of my career, at the end of my degree, my mentor at the time told me, you don't want to be a vet, Leah. Vets are plumbers. They fix animals once they're already broken. You want to get to the root of the problem. And that really spun me in a direction. That's probably the most useful thing I've ever been told in my entire career path that changed my path. And so I went to do a master's degree in environment and development, which was the first degree of its kind. And there were only 3 such, it was like a sustainable development degree at the time. And there was one in University of London, or in King's College, University of London, one at Tufts, and one in Boston at BU. And I decided to go to London. And when I got to London, first of all, because it was way cheaper, and it was 1 year. And when I got there, it turned out they're 20 years ahead of us. And there was this huge professional environment for people advocating for farmed animals that I had never had any exposure to in the United States at the time. So that was in 1999, just to date myself a little bit. And it blew my mind that you could help animals in this other way besides being a vet. And my first job right out of the gate was with Compassion in World Farming, which is an international farmed animal organization. And I started off as a researcher, and I soon found I had a knack for strategy and big picture thinking. And this just grew and grew and grew. And I lived there for 10 years in London. And I worked then for what is now called World Animal Protection, which was called WISPA at the time, World Society for the Protection of Animals. And I oversaw campaigns in 14 different countries, everything you can imagine, from bullfighting in Spain to working horses in Colombia to bear bile farming in China, advocating for dolphin and stopping the dolphin trade. So I would go to the International Whaling Commission. I would go to CITES for endangered species trade rules. I got exposed to all the different ways that humans cause suffering to animals. And at the end of about 7 years of doing that, I realized what I really wanted to do, and that was farmed animals. Because after all, there's so much suffering caused by humans. There's so many ways that we impact animals in a negative way. But this one issue to me is the most tractable one, the one we can do something about because people participate in it 3 times a day. We can make the most change. So I made a pretty significant decision to focus just on farmed animals then. I ended up moving back to the United States, to Georgia. And at the time, I remember telling Compassion in World Farming I wanted to open up an office for them. And they were like, in Russia? And I was like, no, it's a state, it's in the South. And they're like, we never heard of it, but okay. And I ended up opening Compassion in World Farming USA and grew that office from scratch and focused on broilers. And if anybody knows me, you can see my pin. I'm a big chicken. I'm the chicken lady. And I focus on chickens. I really believe they're 90% of all land factory farmed animals, and they need so much protection. They have almost no protection globally. And that has been my path. And I am so honored to work at Mercy for Animals, where we can have such global impact. There are so many opportunities for folks like you. And looking at the agenda, I was so excited because there was no animal law conference when I was a student. That was not a career. That was something that you might do on the side because you got a firm got asked to cover like something, but it was not a career. And look at this room. You're all here as animal lawyers, and that gives me so much hope about the future and what will 20 years from now look like. If this is 20 years on from when I started, 20 years from now, it's going to be even better. So thank you for even being here and caring and wanting to make change for animals.
Thank you so much, Leah. Christina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Stella. I'm a managing attorney in the litigation program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. So I'm assuming most folks are familiar with ALDF, but in the civil litigation program, we focus on kind of 3 major areas. One is farmed animals, one is captive wildlife and wild wildlife. And then one is kind of like civil enforcement and really focusing on changing animals' legal status under the law. So I, as a managing attorney, manage all of our farmed animal work. That includes our ag-gag litigation, what we call tag-gag litigation, to challenge laws that prohibit plant-based companies from advertising their products. We do consumer protection suits against meat and dairy companies, lots of environmental law, all different kinds of things. As I'm sure most of you are already familiar, there's so few laws that allow us to just actually protect farmed animals and enforce those laws and actually improve their quality of life, that at ALDF, we really try to tackle, we try to use all of the other laws that are available to us to kind of hurt the industry as much as we can. My path to ALDF, kind of in a similar vein, like I'm so jealous of all of you that this exists for you and you have people to ask what to do and that animal law exists. I didn't have that. And so I just grew up loving animals, but never, ever, ever occurred to me that it could be a career at all, and definitely not a career as a lawyer. So when I was in college and undergrad, I had a series of experiences that made me really interested in immigration law. Learning more about immigration law led me to learn about agricultural law and policy and how broken that is in the United States. And so I went to law school with the goal of trying to reform food systems and try to advocate for sustainable food systems. And I remember in law school actually going to my career services center and saying, I want a career in food law. And I will never forget, the counselor wheeled her chair around to her computer and typed into Google food law. I was like, I don't think you're helping me. I could have done that at home, but anyway, so yeah, I just tried to cobble together as many different, internships and classes and everything that I could, focused on agricultural policy. And then I did a clerkship for the Supreme Court of Maine, of all places, when I got out of law school. And then after that, I started a fellowship at the Center for Food Safety, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco that advocates for sustainable food systems. So I did a 2-year fellowship, then I became a staff attorney, and I realized that I was advocating, a lot of my work was advocating against the factory farming industry, but it was really on behalf of consumers who were eating animal products, but who wanted them to be raised better and, you know, healthier and all of that. And I just had this epiphany, like, what am I doing? You know, I don't want to be advocating for people to be able to eat animals. I want to be advocating for the animals and to help them get out of that system. So luckily, ALDF was one of the organizations I had worked most closely with in my time at CFS. So I transitioned over. I've been at ALDF for 5 years now. I started as, I think, a staff attorney, then became a senior staff attorney, now a managing attorney. And our program really continues to grow. You know, when I came to ALDF, I was I don't want to say the only person doing farmed animal work, but the only person doing the type of work that we're doing now, like the more environmental stuff. And now there's like 8 attorneys on our civil litigation program that do this work. And what I love it, my colleagues don't as much, that every time we interview fellows and law clerks, what draws you to ALDF? And everyone's like, I want to work on farmed animal stuff, which I love to hear. So I think it's definitely growing. And yeah, that was my path. And I'm just really happy to be here and happy to answer any questions to help all of you not have to spend the time that all of us did figuring out how to get here.
Thank you, Christina. And Jamie.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jamie McLaughlin. I am an animal law LLM candidate at Lewis and Clark here in Portland. I'm also staying to complete an LLM in environmental law. And the reason I'm doing that is because of the intersection of environmental law and farmed animal law. So I took a long time to get to animal law. Before this, I worked for 17 years as a certified financial planner. I owned my own Ameriprise financial franchise. And then in about 2015, I started to look at my career and traveling back and forth to Silicon Valley and said to myself, is this really what I want to do? Is this my passion? I loved my clients, but I didn't necessarily love crunching numbers all the time. It was not very glamorous, didn't enjoy it. And I don't like math. Don't ask me how I started this career. Anyway, so I started to research animal law. And when I started Googling that, the first thing that came up was like ALDF and some of the different orgs that are before you this morning. And then I found this book by Yolanda Eisenstein. It's called Careers in Animal Law. She's working on a new edition, by the way. That one was a 2015 edition. And so I started reading through that and looked at all the different things that I could do. I could become a lobbyist, or, you know, I could work as an attorney, or I could do dog bite stuff, or there was all these things. So I decided to take the plunge and study for the LSAT and go to law school later in life. And so I did that. I went to DePaul in Chicago, and partially because I had a Center for Animal Law Studies there, did some work for them. And then I came out to Portland and took a look around. I wanted to meet some of these folks and see if this is really what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing, and see if they were crazy or not, or normal. They were pretty normalish. And so then the next step was looking at all the different things that you can do in animal law and figuring out how I wanted to fine tune that. I had the pleasure of working for Christina at ALDF as a clerk one summer. I also clerked for the Humane Society of the United States and did a lot of my work on farmed animal stuff. I've also clerked for Non-Human Rights Project. And so when I started to look at all of these different topics that you can focus on in animal law, whether that's companion animals, animal testing, wildlife, farm, like there's so many different things to focus on. I kind of boiled it down to 2 major problems that are affecting animals today. One is this huge farmed animal problem we have. It affects the most animals on the planet. The other is animal status and them just having no rights whatsoever. And I thought, okay, these are the 2 big problems. If you can solve these things, then you can basically solve all the other problems. That's just my thought. And working on it a little bit more, I determined that farmed animal advocacy was my passion. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time on my grandma's farm. And it was a traditional farm, so it wasn't as scary as some of the stuff that we see today. but it had a big impact on me. Sorry. So I am just focusing on farmed animal stuff right now. I recently wrote an article about ventilation shutdown, which affects pigs and chickens. It's very brutal if you don't know about it. That article is going to be published anytime now in the Drake Journal of Agricultural Law, of all places, which is I'm happy about, because I think more people in the ag industry need to face some of the issues that they're creating. So that's in a nutshell. I just want to thank you guys for being here. I know everyone is mostly, students right now, and you have reading to do and papers to draft and all these crazy things, but hopefully you're going to get a lot out of the conference today, and you'll get to meet new people, make new contacts. Be sure to do all the networking, take it seriously, write down people's names because I forget them all the time. Okay, get numbers and stuff like that, connect on LinkedIn, and just make sure you make the most of your time here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's so fun to find out how different our paths can be, but we all end up in the same room. I'm so excited to hear more about your paths in a few years once you're all graduated and working and here and maybe even on this panel. So thank you so much for being here. A little bit about me before we get started with questions, just so I'm not a complete stranger, is that I am a 2016 graduate from Lewis and Clark Law School. During my time there, I interned with Mercy for Animals, Animal Legal Defense Fund's litigation program, and the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. I also acted as the public relations chair and the co-director of the student chapter and the 2014 Animal Law Conference coordinator, student coordinator. And currently in my role, I lead all of our student chapter programmatic work. So I work with a lot of you, and you'll probably get sick of seeing my name in your inbox. So nice to put some faces to those names. Okay, with all of that out of the way, we will start Q&A. We'll have about an hour of Q&A, and then we have a half hour scheduled just to network, continue those conversations, mingle with our lovely panelists. So if you want to queue in line at the mics, we'll get started, but I do have a few questions. All right, so Brian, for students graduating this year, or any students, any advice on networking and job search tips, especially in a more digitalized age?
Sure. So I think a piece of advice that I would keep in mind when looking for positions in animal protection is what I found in my experiences. You can be a specialist or you can be a generalist. And there's a lot of opportunities for one or both of those tracks. So in my example, I applied for positions, and I am in a position right now with our legislative affairs program where I am a generalist. I need to know a little bit, pretty much about everything, because I work on farm animal protection. I work on captive wildlife. I work on puppy mills. I work on virtually any issue that there could be a piece of legislation on, either good or bad. I got to know a little bit about. In the specialist route, kind of like Christina, where she focuses on farm animal protection. And so I think when you're looking at job positions and postings and thinking about your skills and your interests, keeping that context in mind of what you want to do, where you would fit best, and what position you're looking at. And I alluded to this in my opening is, I mean, perusing, it seems so obvious, but perusing those employment pages and refreshing and keeping that active and alive, and then thinking about your networks, where people are that could help impact going a certain route for a position, is really helpful information to keep in mind. I mean, I peruse so many credible, legitimate state and national animal protection organizations, and there were a lot of different positions I knew would not fit me at all, and others that I knew would. And so I became a generalist because I go to bed at night saying, you know, if I focused on one particular area, I know my mind would run and I'd say, well, what about the puppies and puppy mills? And what about the animals being tested on? And what about the cats? And what about wildlife and trophy hunting? So being a generalist, while it's a little more stressful because I could get pinged with a question about anything at any time from legislators and staff, it was more fitting for kind of my approach. So, and then part of that question was networking. Really just never undervalue and underestimate any potential value of the networking contact, even if it's a networking contact now. I mean, I look back in my experience and folks that I networked with, whether it had been in politics or anything else that I never thought I would, you know, have to encounter again, or we could be helpful to each other. Now, those folks are very helpful, and we've been mutually helpful to each other in our lines of work. So that would just be my general answer to that question.
I was going to ask if I could add something on the networking point. Excuse me. I remember in law school, they gave us this whole like scary lecture when we first started about how, you know, your legal career starts on day one and the people you're in your classroom with are going to be the people you're working with in 20 years and all of that. And I didn't listen because I was like, I'm not doing corporate law and everyone else will be working together at a firm, so it doesn't matter. But it turned out to be really true too for a nonprofit career. And I just want to stress that in terms of like your network, you're building it now. And the people who you know now, and especially who you're working on these issues with, are the people who are going to be working at organizations, hopefully, where maybe you want to work or you want to partner with them on something. And so much of my work is just built off of personal relationships that I've built up over my career with people at other organizations. And it also holds true even for, you know, like when we get applications from folks and they've worked at organizations who we're really closely aligned with, we just call each other and say like, oh, you know, this person worked with you. How was it? You know, like we're all connected. It's a very small world. So I do just want to stress that point of like everything, not in a bad way, like that you need to be on guard all the time, but really in a good way that like you're building your network now, and every interaction that you have in the animal law world and even beyond is helping you build your network. So your network is really bigger than you think.
So true. I have so many classmates who are now colleagues and collaborators. It really is true. I didn't listen either.
Could I add something on that as well? Okay, so I know some of you are introverts. Pretty sure you are. When I heard all the networking talks as a student and a lawyer and for years, I just thought, oh my God, I'm screwed. Like if I have to walk into one more cocktail party and make like charming, memorable conversation with people I've never met before, like we're done. We're just done. That's one of the reasons, as I said, that I recommend making sure you're always doing something for animals, because for years and years, I was not working full-time in animal law. I was a columnist for our Hen Houses website. I taught as an adjunct at law schools. I taught animal law. I came up with things that were really interesting and exciting. Bar associations have animal law committees. When I moved to New York, the first thing I did was join the New York City Bar Association. You don't have to just strike up cold conversations with everyone you see. You can get to know people as you work with them. Just make sure you're taking advantage of those opportunities.
Thank you. All right, I see we have a question. Please say your name and school before asking.
Hi, my name is Morgan Boutier, and I'm a 3L at UCLA. And I wanted to ask Piper if you could expand on some of the ways that you draw on your experience as a civil rights litigator at Animal Outlook.
Sure. Geez, talk about my work. Yeah, twist my arm. Well, there are many ways. One is just the idea of class actions, which has not historically been, it's not a clear fit for most of the animal litigation that we do. But it can fit if you know what you're looking for, and it can be hugely impactful, and it can get big headlines, and it can result in attorney's fees. And the beauty of that is that private lawyers will copy it. You've just leveraged yourself a million times, because private lawyers who are not even into animal law will say, hey, that class action was successful. I'm going to find another one of those animal agriculture people and bring a class action against them. Another way is that I find certain causes of action in unusual places. So both the procedures and the substance. One of my strategies is to assault the animal agriculture industry as a profitable industry. This is an industry that externalizes a mind-boggling percentage of their costs. And if they could not do that, they would no longer be profitable. So bringing lawsuits about whatever they're doing wrong, including in the employment arena, helps, makes progress there. And all those corporate lawyers that I was stuck in law school with for 3 years, they write checks, they do pro bono work, their associates do pro bono work. Law firms are requiring pro bono hours now. Really useful. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Could I add something to that? So that was a great point about how you can leverage all these things that you've learned in a previous career. And as you guys know, I mentioned I worked in finance, and I didn't really see at first how that went together with animal law. I'm speaking on a finance topic today, but one of the things that I'm focusing on is using security laws to go after big ag, especially with the SEC's new ESG rules that they're about to promulgate. So never underestimate the fact that you can take something you learned from a class that seems completely unrelated to animal law and find a very novel way to use it to benefit animals. So keep your eyes open for those ideas, because as Christina mentioned earlier, there are really no laws to help animals in farm. So try to be creative and open-minded when it comes to those things.
And sign up for corporations next semester, really. Believe it or not.
It's so true. During my first year of law school, I was told animal law is all law, and that really has stuck with me. There is always some connection, and if you are struggling to find that connection, please talk to someone of us or anyone at the conference or anyone in your network, and we can brainstorm ideas about how to kind of combine your interests or your passions. But animal law truly does cross over so many areas. I see we have a question here.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Monica Larson. I'm at the University of Miami. I wanted to go back to that law firm pro bono idea. For those of us that will be working in private practice, how do you recommend that we encourage pro bono specifically for animals at our law firms? And also a plant-based lifestyle or eating, because there's so many times that we have catered events and, you know, just other situations where there's food. If you have some tips for that.
You look like you were ready to
You
go.
were ready to go.
But I've already answered an extra one. Okay. So at ALDF, we have a pro bono program, and that kind of like marshals this whole pro bono network to help us, or not to help ALDF necessarily, but even our members of the public who contact us wanting help with various animal issues that maybe we don't work on, but they need legal help. And so that's one of the best resources that I know of, like not just to plug ALDF, but I do really think it is a really strong network where firms can enroll, like not individual associates, but like the firm pro bono manager will sign their program up to, you know, assign out work. And we have really strong partnerships. Like we just had a case that went to, or was going to go up to the Supreme Court, our Kansas Ag case. And as a result of a very long pro bono relationship with the law firm Oric, the private firm, like we got pro bono help at the Supreme Court for that case. So there's a lot that pro bono lawyers can do at firms to help animals for sure. And I would definitely encourage whatever firm you're at to join that network so that you just get kind of like the calls when people need help with animal law issues. I'd imagine Priscilla has stuff to say about the event, how to host vegan events, if that's what you
Yeah, I
do.
do. And I was gonna plug also for new graduates. So once you do graduate, we have a complimentary year membership to that pro bono network if you are interested in joining. So definitely look out for information about that closer to your graduation. Leah, do you have?
Yeah,
anything?
I will say we rely very heavily on pro bono counsel for, and it's not for just litigations and exciting Supreme Court thing. It's like for employment issues or contracts or film contracts, like very specific like areas that we could never afford as a nonprofit to have that kind of internal expertise. And so our relationships with external firms are critical for us. And again, it's not for the kind of necessarily, though it does too, the kind of exciting litigation kind of advocating sort of thing, but how to run our organization well. And if you're in a firm, contact the organizations you want to help and ask them and then come back to your firm. Be an advocate inside your organization for the type of pro bono work that you would like to see your firm doing. And I think that you'll find it's actually probably fairly easy as you work your way up the ladder, of course. In terms of the plant-based, I would say it's just like everywhere else. It's just like Thanksgiving dinner with your family, you know, it's coming with an open mind and kindness and really delicious food. Plenty of cake, plenty of surprise items that people are like, I can't believe this is, you know, plant-based. Growing a community and interest in your own firm. There's really clear research that if you're a pain, nobody's going to be vegan. We already have that reputation. So we need to help ourselves. You know, if we are judgy, if we are forcing it, then it doesn't work. So having a very open environment in which you are creating invitation and inclusion is the best way in any circumstance. And that goes for inside your law firm too.
And afterwards, come see me. My bag's over there. Meet me there. I know somebody who just went through this. She wanted to do pro bono work for us. She's at a big firm. And it took a while before they would authorize her to do anything for us because we represent, I mean, because they represent a lot of the animal agriculture industry. It was a long strategy and it succeeded. So I don't know how, but I can put you in touch with her.
And I would be remiss if I did not plug priority legislation for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, known as Courtroom Animal Advocate Program bills. So these bills, if they become law, provide potentially a lot of nice opportunity for pro bono work. Thus far, Connecticut and Maine have courtroom animal advocate programs on the books. We have bills pending in New Jersey, and we will have one in New York next session that could very well move. And what's great is we already have, I think, a list of 40 attorneys in New Jersey that have signed up to do pro bono work as courtroom animal advocates through a former state senator who is also an attorney that we work closely with. If New Jersey passes CAP, we will have those opportunities. So there's always, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't plug the legislative potential for more pro bono work through the passage of more CAP laws. And those are really monumental because if they apply to, if the cruelty statute applies to the whole brute creation, then it would apply to farmed animal cruelty cases in which a judge can then appoint an advocate to speak for those animals during those judicial proceedings. So very important opportunities. And that's where we're on the cusp of not just traditional opportunities for pro bono, the way that you've heard, but novel and really nice opportunities such as that we're working on.
Thank you.
All right, you have been so patient. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kat Kelly. I'm currently at 2L at Livingston Park. So this would be a question for Brian, but all expertise is welcome. It's been a bit of a struggle going to a legal school, but also having a really strong interest in legislation and policy and how to actually break into that field, especially for farmed animals. Do you have any advice for internships, like how to reach out to different people, offices to consider? Just how do you cross the bridge from litigation over to legislation?
Well, I mean, I never started in litigation. I'm not an attorney. I've always been in policy and lobbying and campaigns. So I think you can cross that bridge no matter what you're doing. I mean, if you are an attorney, you can, if you're more introverted, there are legislative staffing opportunities in state capitals, the federal government. For example, Office of Legislative Services, a lot of that staff are attorneys who work on legislation, draft legislation for legislators. So whether you're introverted or extroverted, if you have an interest in legislation, there are a lot of opportunities either working directly for a legislator, working for those legislative staffing offices, working for nonprofits that work that legislation. I mean, a lot of nonprofits have legislative affairs programs, and they are also expanding. Case in point, ALDF, in just 4 years, we've expanded to a team of 7. And it used to be a team of 1 just 3-4 years ago. So there is a lot of appetite for that. The more that there is really good criminal justice prosecutions and litigation work, and we see where there are very blatant holes in the system, one of the ways to fill that is through legislation. So I think if you can speak to people in your networking opportunities who are legislators, who work for legislators, who are in any of those capacities, or really get a feeling of what their day-to-day jobs are like. I mean, I interned in a partisan legislative office in the Capitol. I was in the thick of it, in campaigns, talking about these issues in a political context, and then now in a legislative policy context, working in a nonprofit sector. So there's a lot of different flavors of the same thing. And I think where your interests are and what fits your personality best, talking to the people who are in those roles that you respect and trust to get the feel, I would strongly suggest. And if you need some connections, what better people than in the room and us to provide perhaps some connections for you to speak to.
I'll just add that I think I observe in my career, it's a very common pathway actually to go be a litigator and then go into legislation. And then often what I see in our government affairs team is then they go on to be our leaders. They go on to be our current managing director, used to be the government affairs director, and she's a lawyer. Kitty Block, who is the HSUS's CEO, is a lawyer. And I used to go to the International Whaling Commission, and she was essentially doing litigation type work. So it's a very common pathway because the mindset that you have to have is very similar. It's strategic, detailed, also big picture. There's very few people that can think like that. And that's a very, I think, common roadmap to getting not only into legislative work, but into leadership, which is you're doing, leading teams in a generalist way, thinking big picture and understanding where are the strategic opportunities, but you also need to know the legal landscape, the legislative landscape to be able to do that. So I think you'd find you're on the right path if that's where you're going and you're headed to leadership. So well done.
Thank you so much. And just to follow up, there are often volunteer opportunities with campaigns, coalitions. So just getting involved at that level, whether it's, signature gathering or going to lobby, and just gaining that experience while you're a student can also be incredibly beneficial because like we've been saying, you never know who you might meet and where that might lead to next. So thank you, Kat.
Thank you so much.
Do you have it? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. My name is, that's loud. My name is Ankita Shankar. I'm a PhD candidate at the Universities of Basel and Antwerp, Switzerland and Belgium respectively. I've actually written this down so I don't forget anything. So I'm developing a world moot on animal rights law and a corresponding training course aimed at mooters and coaches. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment is writing the moot problem. What I wanted to ask all of you is, which areas of law and within them, which topics would you say are most useful to train law students in from the perspective of litigation, advocacy, just something that they could learn whilst they're in law school that they can contribute to the abolitionist agenda?
I guess I'll take that one as the student. One class that is very important for all animal law students is administrative law. A lot of times when you are advocating for animals, you're going to be not dealing with bad actors who are individuals. You're going to be trying to get agencies to do their job. So it's really important that you take administrative law. If you're interested in rights issues, I think, Piper has talked about what she did in civil rights, and that's extremely important. It's also important to remember, like, as we've mentioned here, that animal law is every type of law. And not only that, if you understand human rights and intersectionality and all these things, these problems don't exist individually in separate silos. When we're talking about farmed animal issues, we're also talking about workers' rights. We're also talking about the environment. And I think it's extremely important that as we address these issues, that we try to touch on every aspect of them. So basically any classes that you can take that will expose you to those things, like civil rights cases, constitutional law, environmental law, and of course, administrative, but you can't go wrong. I mean, just take the things that are interesting to you, because, for example, if you're really interested in taxes, maybe in law school, you'll figure out a way to go after big ag using tax law. So keep an open mind about it.
Yeah, I want to echo that the type of law you should do, or the classes or the focus, is the one that you're excited about. And if you stop like right now, think about your favorite class you ever took, or the one you're really excited about taking. That's the one you should lean into, because this is, some people will come into this work and be like, this is my dream job. I'll just be really honest, this is nobody's dream job. It's a hard path. And so you want to find the intersection. It's a hard path in the sense that there are 80 billion farmed animals that are raised and slaughtered every year, and that number is going up every year. And so when you get into this, you have to find your place that you wake up every morning excited to solve, because you're not going to solve the whole thing, but you may be part of solving a part of it. So you need to find the thing that like makes your heart beat faster, makes butterflies in your stomach, and you're like, I'm interested in this. I care about this. I really want to pursue this. And that might be taxes. It might be corporate. We talked, you mentioned like take corporate law. I cannot tell you how important corporate law is. And I'm speaking a little bit about this tomorrow in my talk. It's one of our biggest challenges, is navigating how to hold companies accountable without them being able to say we infringe on trademark, or we're, defamation cases. How can we say you're being cruel without them suing us? How do we hold them accountable? And corporate specialization is so important to be able to navigate the strategic pathway to put impact on institutions. So I will just say, literally any area of law could be useful. So find the thing, and I say this to my team, that makes your heart sing, that just makes you want to get out of bed and fight, because it's a long path, this work. It's really hard. But if you can find the thing that makes you excited, it will carry you further, and you'll have more impact. I often tell people, find the intersection of what you're good at and what you love. That's where you want to go.
Could not have said that better myself.
Yeah, just to add, I totally agree with everything that's been said, just to add some more specific examples of classes too. So some of the ones I think that have been most helpful to the people on our team, definitely administrative, environmental, consumer protection, class action, legislation, And then, oh, like First Amendment, all of that, like you need expertise in so many different things to be able to use it, or you could develop expertise in so many different things and use it for animals. So those are some of the ones that we use. And then I'll just say from my personal experience, the classes that taught me how to be a public interest lawyer, I still think about. Like I remember I had a class called like tools for the 21st century public interest lawyer or something like that. And it was at each class, like one was litigation, then one was like building campaigns, one was yeah, like direct service, you know, it just kind of like really covered all the different ways that you can use your law degree, but also how your law degree complements other types of work within a social movement. And I took a class on social movements, like all of that, I think has really helped me put my litigation work and legal work in perspective. That's helped me figure out how to leverage it for the greater movement in a way that I would like to think has been effective. So anything that teaches you just how to think like a public interest lawyer, I think is really helpful too.
I also agree with everything that's been said. And in addition to envying all of you, I now also envy Christina that her law school could spell public interest. Like, that's pretty cool. So all of that is true. And you will never take all of those classes. And that's fine.
Yeah.
Part of the mindset in this kind of work is the next case could come from anywhere. You don't know, you have to keep your mind open, read broadly about what lawyers in other fields are doing, and just have the understanding that you are going to have to learn stuff from scratch, even after you've been doing this for decades.
And I'll throw in for a world that, so just take everything. That's the moral of this. But not necessarily to take an election law course, but perhaps an elective or a supplemental looking at election law. In an era of increased polarization, increased gerrymandering on steroids, where, I mean, 50, 60, 70 years ago, you had a lot more competitive districts on a state legislative and a federal legislative level. You had much more on the spectrum, the moderates and the center of political parties being the ones exerting more voice. Now things are more polarized, more gerrymandered. That impacts what laws are made. And sometimes catering to the extremes on either side is not good for animals. And so that has an impact on litigation, lawmaking. So, you know, keeping that in mind, you know, politics and elections impact who's elected, obviously, which impacts what laws are made, which impacts what we can litigate, what we can prosecute. So that's something very important.
Great points. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. My name is Altamir Said. I'm actually from Pakistan, and I'm an LLM and animal law candidate here at Lewis and Clark Law School. And I'm actually the second person from Pakistan, so I've heard these crazy things like, what the hell are you doing? And I've heard that veterinary question many times. So I understand where you're coming from, and thank you for that hope. But my question is actually, it's about a global perspective, because I'm doing animal welfare work in my country. And I just wanted to connect it with the US first. For example, when Hurricane Katrina happened, and I'm researching on this, I wasn't able to find any numbers on the farm animals that died in that disaster. It was just 250,000 pets that died, and that led to the Pets Act. That is amazing. I'm glad that happened. And there are some new laws in motion in the US, such as the Prepared Act and the PAWS Act. But in Pakistan, I just want to give some people here who don't know about this, but there's a huge flood going on in my country, and over 1.16 million livestock animals have died. And that's crazy. So this is a question very, I know it's global, so it's okay. And I'm really looking for actually some inspiration. So in the global south, for example, in countries that do not have that kind of resources that normally developed countries have, I'm actually researching on this area, and I'm developing this area of the connection between human welfare, animal welfare, environmental welfare. But I don't know how to basically firstly inculcate the idea that animals are worthy of protection in disasters. Of course they are, I know that. And one of the ways, of course, is to amending the law, and I'm working on developing a project that amends the National Disaster Management Act in Pakistan. But I want to know more creative ways how you got to do that, because Pakistan needs to save its animals, and clearly we need to save animals across the globe wherever they are. That's what I want, and I know everybody in this room wants that as well. And the other question is actually slightly linked to disaster zones, so I'm still learning. And while I'm getting the animals emergency vet care and food, I want to do more, and I still don't know how to use a disaster zone in the best way to help farm animals. So, these questions. Thank you.
I'm kind of excited to answer your questions. So first of all, I can kind of hear the overwhelm and despair in your voice of like the size of the task. And I just want to say how important you are working where you are. There in the global south, there's far less resources, there's far less case law and history and policy. And so you're a hero where you are. You're forging a path and pioneering, and it's so important you stay on that path. It's also important you connect, and I'm so glad you're here to do that. And I wanted to, I hope she doesn't mind. Paula, can you raise your hand? Yes, that was so short. Raise your hand longer. Paula leads our team, our legal team in Brazil. And there may be some use in you two talking about how to connect and how to make the most of a landscape that has it's a newer landscape for this area. And at Mercy for Animals, we really believe strongly we need, in your part of the world, in Southeast East Asia, 80% of all farmed animals live in Southeast and East Asia. But 80% of the resources, the funds raised, are spent in the United States and the EU. It's flipped. It's the wrong way. There are so many animals that need help, and figuring out strategies and pathways to have an impact is really, really important. And one thing that I wanted to say, if you haven't heard of it, is there was a resolution passed at the United Nations in February. It's called a Nexus Resolution on animal welfare. And what it did is it connected and asked the UN. It's the first time a resolution had ever been passed the United Nations on animal welfare. It was in Kenya at the UNEP, and it connected animal welfare to the environment and looked at the nexus. Do you know about this? Have you heard about it? Okay, so I think it's the start of a pathway for what you're talking about. So a report has to be written, and your country has to contribute. And Pakistan, I believe, was one of the what's it called, countries that was on the resolution. See, I'm not a lawyer. I'm now exposing myself. Not a signatory, but the one who put it forward, whatever that word is. There were 6 countries, and Pakistan was one of them. And so they made a connection between biodiversity loss, climate change, and animal welfare, because the very systems that are causing harm to animals are the same systems that are causing floods and climate change. And they want a report written that will then lead to actions. So I would suggest that would be a really good avenue for you to get in with, and we can talk later and I can connect you to folks who are working on that. But I think Pakistan is one of the countries leading on that, and that could be a really good avenue for connecting animal welfare and the floods that you're experiencing.
Thank you. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
On. Yes. Hi, my name is Olivia Ruthven. I'm a 3L at Suffolk University in Boston. So when I heard Brian talking about being a generalist versus a specialist, the generalist definitely stood out to me because I always have that. What if I specialize and I find something else I'm very interested in? And there's so many areas. Every time I learn about something else, I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. I want to do that. So I'm wondering if it makes any sense to start as a generalist and from there kind of figure out if there's more an area that could be by interest of focus, and if there's other areas of being a generalist other than legislation. So I think that an issue that I'd be curious about your thoughts with legislation and talking with other people who you said have different morals and priorities, how you get them to care about this. It's like, it's one thing for us to all care, we all do, but then people who have for example, money as much higher priority, or any other priorities, how do you get them to care about this?
Yeah, so let's take your second part first. So I think that's the fundamental challenge of being a good lobbyist and a good advocate, is finding out how someone who you're speaking with who may not care about animals, to get them to move in a direction that is beneficial to animals. And I kind of found, the hard way, where I just stopped trying to persuade some of the folks that I speak with to care about animals, because at the end of the day, some folks are never going to care about animals as much as you and I. Finding parallels and connections to how our issues impact them, and why, through their lens of seeing the world, or through their lens of what they care about, how our issues tie in. And I think, we see with prosecuting, passing stronger laws on animal fighting, for example, there's often other criminal enterprises going on in those areas. So I may be speaking with legislators who don't necessarily, that's not their priority issue, but when you discuss the other criminal elements in the communities that could impact their neighborhoods, then animal fighting becomes of interest. There are so many examples of this. Whatever the issue is, you can find some parallel or some connection to legislators or folks who don't care as much about animals, and really try to, one strategy I do before I meet with a legislator or staff is I do some quick background research. Where does this person go to school? Who do they work for? What are their interests? And then it's like, oh, well, maybe their daughter is in vet school, or there's some 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, 6 degrees of separation connecting to the animal issue that you can find common ground on and connections to. And I have found virtually every piece of legislation I've worked on, either led or been a part of getting passed, has had overwhelming bipartisan support. It's doable. You have to sometimes sit down with folks you don't agree with. You have to have uncomfortable conversations. You have to be creative in thinking about how to reach them on their level through their lens. And it's not changing your own ethics or your own values, but it's just changing the approach to the conversation and how to strategically communicate to benefit animals at the end of the day. And I think that's how we can find common ground. And there's so many examples of it. We could talk offline about it, but it is doable. And I love speaking with people. I love having meetings where we go into it and they are just diametrically opposed. And then at the end of the meeting, they're scratching their head like, well, wow, you really broke the mold, didn't you? And yeah, we can show that there are so many connections to our issues. It's just knowing who you're speaking with, understanding their lens, and creating a craftful message that reaches them on their own terms. And that's just one way of doing it. Now, your first question, I forgot.
Being a generalist,
Yes.
and if that's a good way to start, if you have a recommendation, if that's just how to stay with the career, or if it is worth focusing on something more specific. Obviously, it's person by person.
I think it depends. One factor depends on where you may be applying for a job, where you may be starting your career. I've seen a lot of generalists go to then be specialists, and that's not the only way, but that's what I've seen most. For example, as a state director at a large animal protection organization, I was a generalist. I covered one area, the state, and I could work on 100 different issues regarding animals. And oftentimes people transition from there to be on the wildlife campaign, to work on the farm animal protection campaign, to work on the puppy mill campaign. because you'll get exposure and experience to a whole slew of different issues. And it may change your own perspective. You may go into it saying, I think I care most about X, and then you work in it and you realize you care most about Y, and then you want to go focus on that. So I've seen it go that way. Now, the other way around, people are specialists and then they get tired of that track and perhaps want to expand out, and then they go expand out. I think it depends. Some areas are easier to be generalists than others. And in my program, we're all generalists. None of us are experts about any specific issue. We go to Christina if we need to talk about farm animal stuff. Like I did the other day, I messaged her, help, help. So that's normal, that happens. And so I found being a generalist was really eye-opening. I came into animal welfare really not knowing exactly what I want to focus on. And I found that staying the generalist route gives me the most flexibility because I get to work on, I care about all these issues intensely. So just for me personally, I don't want to be limited to only working on puppy mills or only working on factory farms or only working on wildlife. I want to work on all of it.
I just want to make a plug that I have a book called it's Grilled, Turning Adversaries into Allies. And it's about this matter of how to sit down with people that don't agree with you. And I know you all have to read so much, so don't do the book. Instead, there's a 13-minute TED Talk. And that's, and then if you don't have time for 13 minutes, you can do it on speed and 1.5 speed. And it goes through 3 points about how to build bridges with people you don't agree with. Because most of my career has been sitting down with Purdue and Tyson, with transit, like working directly with factory farmers who I thought were my enemy, but turns out they have much in common. And the main point is start with what you have in common, not with what you disagree on, and build from the commonality. And that can be, like you said, like research the people before. And at one point, I seriously thought this was a good idea. It wasn't. I thought I needed to learn about American football because I did not grow up really in the United States. And I was like, every time I'm in these meetings, like all the corporate dudes are talking about the last football game and I am not following anything. And they would, exchange this like conversation. One of my New Year's resolutions was like, I'm going to learn about American football. I'm going to like figure it out. I didn't. That was not a good idea. I let go of that. But there are other ways, like finding out about their dogs and cats. Like everybody has dogs and cats. Finding out in the meeting, like who's the dogs, who is this dog? Then even like sending them dog treats and like dog gifts sometimes afterwards, just to create warmth and a humanity between you and the because I do this with, whether it be a government official or an institution, because we try to affect institutions. There's so many ways. We refer to it as the tyranny of the small differences. And that's what blocks progress, is obsessing over all the differences rather than building on the commonalities.
Thank you.
Yeah, Leah, I love that story about football. I had a dark moment myself in my career when I thought I need to watch sports. Like, I don't know when I'm gonna do that. I've got to learn.
I had that dark moment. I still refuse to watch sports. So
Me too. Never did it. I'm still here. So just so you know. So I would absolutely read Leah's book. And I would keep in mind that there is a large body of scholarship about this very question. How do you persuade people, generally speaking, and how do you persuade people in this subject matter? And there's, sometimes there's resistance because people are accustomed to the way that they've always messaged out and want to keep doing that. But social science is our friend. There's a couple organizations. One is called Beyond Carnism. And they put out some video classes about this, also about how to be emotionally resilient, because this kind of work will traumatize you if you don't take care of yourself. So Beyond Carnism, and my favorite book on this is called Do You Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger? By Sherry Kolb, who was a law professor at Cornell. I would check those out and just keep the words evidence-based in your heads.
Thank you so much.
I do think we have a virtual question.
Yes, good morning. This is a question from our virtual attendees. In terms of networking, how do you feel about connecting with people on LinkedIn that you don't know? Do you find this off-putting or do you think it's okay?
I could answer that.
Is this a specific? Has someone written us and
None of us denied our invitation.
Yeah, so as I progressed in animal law and started to clerk different places, one of the things I did was just start reaching out to folks that I had met here and other places. And if I noticed other friends were linked into them, I would link into them. I pretty much will link into most people if they don't look completely shady and like they just created their LinkedIn and they have one person that they're linked into. But I do have students reach out to me and ask to just have a call or something, just to talk about what my law school experience has been and to give them some pointers and stuff. And I'm glad to do that. And people have reached out to me on LinkedIn. I've linked into them. We've set up calls and we've done that. So don't be afraid to, reach out to folks that you meet here or people that you don't know at all. And keep in mind, people are super busy. They're like overloaded. So like if 24 hours go by, don't jump off a bridge and think, oh my God, they hate me. Like, they're not answering me, but they'll hopefully get around to it. And some people just don't use LinkedIn as much as others. So, don't be traumatized by it.
Yeah, I forget to check my messages, but every few months I go in there and I'm like, oh, hello, people. And I reply all, I send them my email and we often do connect. So I definitely do think it's a resource, a tool. It's just, yeah, don't take it personally if you don't get that message back, because I don't think everyone is on LinkedIn as often as other social media sites and sort of works differently, but it definitely is a great resource. Anyone else?
I mean, I would just say I'm a little contrarian here. I mean, I have LinkedIn as a tool, but I think it's become so ubiquitous that, at least for me, its value is kind of tapered off a bit. I think while everyone should have it as a tool and it can be a helpful tool, I think there's tremendously more value if you can find, if you don't already have a mentor in your field of interest, in your academics. I mean, I had a couple mentors growing up in different fields who helped connect me to folks who gave me great advice that was worth eons more than any social media, connection or tool helped. So I would just encourage kind of utilize the tools in the toolbox, and LinkedIn is one, but I think those interpersonal connections and the old-fashioned way of doing things, and if you don't already have a mentor, to find one or two or three mentors that you respect that are credible, that could really help open up some doors and build some bridges is even better.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I am working on a mentorship program for next year, so law students can sign up and we'll get you matched. That is in the works. So we are aware of mentorship. It's so important. Definitely reach out to your law schools too. Often they provide mentorship opportunities, and then the student chapters as well for peer-to-peer mentorship.
Yeah, I always have something to say.
Yeah, I love it.
So if it's clear from someone's profile that they are true blue animal advocates, I will accept and I will connect. If not, and I don't know who they are, I won't. And part of the reason for that is that, at least in the farmed animal space, and probably all animal issues, we are up against some very, very serious foes. Animal agriculture is worth billions of dollars a year. They aren't just sitting on their thumbs waiting to get sued. So they will send people to our conferences. They will, I have had somebody connect with me on LinkedIn who proceeded to message me with questions that were clearly about a case I was working on and not friendly. So just for you to keep in mind, like, just be cautious. And for me, it needs to be very obvious where you're coming from.
Yeah, that's such a great point. There are, we call them spies out there, and I do think it's good to be cognizant that sometimes people don't have the best interests of animals, even if they portray that online or something.
I'll just say in that
Or-
vein,
yeah.
I'm more in your camp where I like LinkedIn has become, I don't even know how to use it anymore. There's like, I accept everyone. I don't know who's on there. I don't check the messages. So if you've written me, I just want to apologize because
That's how I use it. I apologize for not responding.
yes,
Yeah,
I can't. It's like, it's too much. So if you, and I, you know, in that vein of what you were just saying, my assumption always in a text message, LinkedIn, Instagram, unless it's somebody that is always, whatever I'm saying is going to be in the New York Times. That was a rule like somebody taught me when I was like 20, whatever you're saying, whatever you're writing, it's going to be in the New York Times. So don't put it in writing. So I don't mind accepting anyone because I'm not going to answer their questions unless I am going, or I'm not going to answer it in a way that wouldn't appear in the New York Times. So that's a mentality that we've had to take because of the fields we work in and how careful we have to be about the work. I do screw up sometimes, Jody. I know my general counsel's looking at me. I'm blocking her. I definitely screw up sometimes, but it's important to do your best to stay in that, within that mindset.
It's like the E in email is for evidence.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are about out of time. I did want to leave on a question for you all. I'm gonna pose two and you can choose which one you want to answer. And we will have networking right after this if you do want to ask your question.
Actually, what Mia said was exactly what is.
Oh, perfect.
Which part? I'm curious, which part? The don't put
part?
anything in writing?
The relationship between executives and in-house legal counsel.
Okay, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So the two questions are any tips for work-life balance and preventing burnout, which is so important? Or what is something that you are most excited about with the future of animal law with all of these amazing students? So I will give you a couple seconds. You always have something to say,
Yeah.
Donna.
Yeah, it will surprise no one that I'm going to answer both. So first off, what I'm excited about, I got involved in this in the 20th century, and we have come so far. It's not always obvious if you haven't experienced that entire development. It can feel like it's futile. We aren't getting anywhere. The world is consuming more animals now than ever. We have come a super long way. So I'm just excited that we're still here, that there's more of us, that we're still going, don't stop. And then what was the first question?
Burnout.
Burnout, right. So I work closely with our undercover investigations team, and I often use the evidence that they collect as my evidence in court. And watching those videos has been bad. It is very bad for me, for my mental health, for my dreams. It is not good. Pay careful attention to that. Read, Google. There's something called secondary traumatic stress disorder, which is PTSD, but from like not experiencing it yourself, being, secondhand. And work-life balance, I take super seriously. When I leave the office, I am done for the day. If there's an emergency, and there are crises happen for litigators, for investigators, text me or call me, and otherwise, like, no, I haven't opened my email today. It's okay to do that. And something that I think sometimes people forget, your phone can be turned off.
Okay, I guess I'll answer the burnout question. I guess I want to really acknowledge that burnout is real. And I want to say now, before it hits any of you, if you burn out, it's not your fault. You're not a failure. You're not letting animals down. Anything that any of us do in our careers or in our personal lives to help animals matters. And I just want to say that now. And I really hope that I hope no one burns out, but if you do, just like, please come back to that, because it's really hard to remember, I think, when you're in the middle of it. And I would say it's really important to have a community to go through this with. So that's one of the things that I'm the most grateful for about the folks that we work with. And even just in the broader community, just having people who truly understand how it feels to do this work and how the things that we see and fight against are affecting all of us, and just have like the true, compassion for animals that we have. Just being in a community of people who really understand that without you having to explain it is invaluable. And I personally have found that having strong relationships with healthy, happy animals in my life has made a bigger difference than I ever would have thought. There are so many times during the day where I just get up and I just go pet my dog or spend time with her, just do something to make her happy. Just something, I don't know if tangible is quite the right word, but just something like immediate that I can do to help an animal in front of me. It washes away a lot of the guilt about not being able to do more for all the animals around the world. So those are my thoughts, and maybe I shouldn't add on like burnout, but I'm just really excited that everyone here, like, I feel like you all are the future, and I think that, yeah, like you said, you're starting from a place that's even more advanced than any of us had. So I'm super excited to see what everyone here does.
Thank you, Christina.
She spends time with her dogs. I scoop litter boxes. No, I mean, seriously, you're going to be no use to animals if you're burnt out. And, the culture is just run, work yourself ragged. And that's not good for productivity. Numerous studies continue to show that employees are more productive when they have the opportunity to fully and truly utilize vacation time, PTO time. So one piece of advice is, if you're not somewhere or you're not looking at an organization that will respect work-life balance, perhaps look elsewhere. And two, don't feel guilty for taking time for self-care. It's absolutely required. If you're not feeling good and healthy and mentally and physically well, then how are you best going to help animals to your best and fullest ability? It's just not doable. How I deal with it, I have a rough week. I just book a cheap flight and I fly somewhere. And I'm like, where's the vegan places? I'm going to eat for 24 hours and fly home. So that's worked miracles. That's worked miracles. I can't believe I'm not 400 pounds. But so definitely it's something that's very important. Strongly stress it. I think I've been blessed to work for organizations that do respect work-life balance, taking PTO, not being afraid of vacation time. It's worthwhile. And, I'll also add, there's a stigma about mental health in this country too. There is no shame with finding a therapist, finding a professional to speak with on a regular basis about these things. I can't watch undercover investigations. The times I have, I've literally sought out a therapist. I'd rather deal with politicians and the sewers that we all swim in that sphere than, looking at undercover videos. So really just taking time for self-care. Have to do it for the sake of the animals.
Well, on that note, I'm going to talk about something I'm excited about. So actually, there's a couple of things. I mentioned earlier that I'm focusing on both environmental law and animal law. For such a long time, there's kind of been a divide where people haven't been working together in this area on commonalities. One of the things I'm really excited about is seeing more people that are interested in animal law also being interested in environmental, and vice versa. It's critical to solve these problems. The other thing I'm really excited about is to see all the international students that are interested in these topics, because looking at farmed animal issues globally, we're exporting all of these US factory farming models all over the world. So it's important to not just have organizations that are focused on wildlife or companion animals, the more popular topics in the global south and other places, but to really make some inroads with some of these students and have them focus on farmed animal issues. So it's great that things are going in that direction. And I think we'll have a lot of change because of that.
All right, I'm gonna go on burnout, just go on the downer. I'm just gonna end on the downer. No, it's on the upper. So first of all, even that we're having this conversation, that is every conference I go to, that is a question, whether I'm speaking, I went and spoke at Vermont Animal Law. And that was a question. We were talking at the Animal Rights Conference, AVA, 2 weeks ago. That was a question. This is something we're aware of, and the culture has categorically changed in the last 5-10 years. 10 years ago, it was, glorified to be a martyr, to burn out, to live on pittance and, barely survive and burn out until you couldn't move. That is unacceptable now. It's unacceptable. Funders don't like it. Boards don't like it. Nobody likes it. So you're already in a great place to move into this world of animal protection because we're all aware of it and we're creating cultures that care for it. Second of all, when you go to apply for a job and you look at the place that you're applying, these are questions you need to ask. You need to ask about the culture of the place and things that you can look for specifically, because this is what matters most in a place, is how does the leadership behave? Leadership have to model self-care. If they don't, the rest of the organization doesn't have permission to do so or doesn't feel they have permission to do so. So you may not want to ask that in your interview because that would be kind of annoying probably, but you want to ask people who work there, what's it actually like? What does the leadership do? Do they take their vacation? Do they email you in the middle of the night or in the weekends and expect a response? What kind of care do they have? Do they have funds for mental health care? We have at Mercy for Animals, we have a stipend for that kind of thing where you can use it for anything you want, from therapists to yoga to, coffee, whatever floats your boat. And the other thing, I have another TED Talk on resilience, what I learned from a chicken on resilience. I recommend you look at that. And it has 3 points on how to stay resilient in this work. And I will reiterate what Christina said. One of the main points for me is remember the joy at the center of the work and connect to the joy at the center of the work. Don't always go to the suffering and the horrors and the way humans treat animals, but remember the joy. Why do we do this? Because we want to see animals joyful. We love them. We think it's their right. And we're not just focused on suffering, but we're focused on the positive, the happy. So farm sanctuaries are a place of extreme importance for me for healing. And seeing happy animals. Like I will tell you, the dodo is my go-to place for happiness and like a little bit of happiness to get me going through the day. And I'll leave you on the note of, this becomes part of our identity over time. It really is who we are. But I will warn you, do not confuse the magnitude of this task with your self-worth. It's different. You are very worthy. The path you're on is worthy. Every time you show up, it's worthy. Don't confuse that with how big this task is.
What a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Hi, everyone. So we're just going to start with the Law Student Scholarship panel. I'm Hira Jaleel. I'm a teaching fellow at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I'm so honored and pleased to introduce our wonderful panelists today. Our first speaker, Trish Conlon, graduated from Willamette Law School in Salem, Oregon in May 2022. Trish is interested in exploring all areas of law in order to find legal and administrative ways to improve the welfare of animals. She will be presenting her paper titled From the Civil War to Civil and Animal Rights. We're very excited to hear from Trish. Our second speaker today is Daria Bedran. Sorry. Okay. Daria is a JD candidate at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Her academic interests center around the most vulnerable and underserved animals in the animal law field, including farmed animals, lab animals, and wildlife. She will be presenting her paper titled Behind Closed Doors, The Fettered Lives of Farmed animals, deficit of legal protection afforded to farm animals in natural disasters. I'd like to welcome Trish and Daria to present their paper.
Thank you.
Well, this is a long time coming. It was like a year ago when I applied to be a part of this program. So it's kind of like come full circle, I guess you can say here. You might be able to tell I was not a traditional K through J dear. I didn't go to law school right out of my undergrad. So I've had a lot of different life experiences. And one of the things that when we heard this last panel kind of touched off was I was on the dark side before. So I was actually a member of Team Ag Ed for Oregon. And I was an honorary FFA member. But I was the strange one. I was the vegetarian in the group. And then they would have the Panera, all the meaty sandwiches, and then there's my little sandwich and stuff. So they put up with me and whatnot. And it was through that experience that I really discovered that agricultural education, they don't all love animals so much. And it kind of opened my eyes, I guess you could say. So when I went to law school, I finally decided to, when I turned 50, I decided it's now or never. It's something I wanted to do for decades. And I ended up at Willamette Law, had a great experience there, and took pretty much every animal law class I could from Professor Beckstead, who is here. And I might make fun of him as we go, just because that's kind of, Beckstead. So I graduated in May, as she mentioned, and I was sworn into the Nevada bar last month. So my husband and I moved to Las Vegas, and I'm going to be, thank you. And I'm going to be starting clerking for a judge in a little over a week. So that was something I did want to do, was to do a judicial clerkship before really jumping into practice, because I really wanted to understand litigation and understand everything that goes on behind the scenes of litigation. I just felt that would make me a better litigator myself. When I was in law school, I was a secretary of the ALDF chapter at Willamette, and I interned with Animal Wellness Action and Center for Humane Economy, and then did little side gigs for Beckstead. He would do the text me, hey, can you take a call? So I'm working on this thing with beavers and how cruel they're being to beavers. Can you research this for me? And, get him whatever he needed to go to the legislature and do stuff. So that was kind of my journey through law school, or getting up to law school, through law school. This opportunity, like I said, I learned about a year ago, and I thought this would be a perfect way to kind of finish off my law school career, being that I'm interested in animal law. So the focus of the program was to look at the issues and potential solutions, and I'm quoting this from the literature, regarding the limited legal protections available for farmed animals in natural and weather-related disasters. So my original idea was looking at the intersectionality between farmed animals and BIPOC communities. But as I moved through my research, as Priscilla says, I kind of organically shifted a bit. So mine isn't necessarily related to natural disasters, but it is somewhat related to natural, it can be related. So we'll just go with that. Study after study, story after story, we know about the that concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs. I did not know what a CAFO was. I did not know that acronym until I jumped into an animal law class. And that was one of the first things that we learned, because Beckstead's passionate about CAFOs and farming. And so it's not just the animals that's toxic. It's also the communities that surround them, which are very often BIPOC communities, and the environment that affects all of us. So we've tried a bunch of different ways of trying to combat what CAFOs do to the animals, to the BIPOC, to the communities, whether they're BIPOC or not, and environment. And it seems like we keep coming up short. And so so the title of my paper, so I'll go back to this, From the Civil War to Civil and Animal Rights. So I found this way of approaching lawsuits, or a different type of lawsuit that might work for animal law. And so that's what I'm focusing on here. So the journey today, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm probably going to talk really fast. So if I'm talking way too fast, wave your hand, because I've got a lot of stuff here in 20 minutes. So we're going to look at the problem. We're going to look at qui tam, which is a possible solution. How many of you have ever heard of a qui tam lawsuit? Okay, so when I was a 1L, 2L, and up until mid 3L year, I wouldn't have raised my hand either. So just so you know. We're going to look at what qui tam is, and then we're going to look at some of those risks and rewards to doing a qui tam lawsuit as a practitioner. So when I first started my research, I sat down and chatted with Professor Matsumoto from Willamette Law, and she works with like environmental justice area, which of course, you know, goes right into what we're talking about. She's worked a lot with CAFOs. She actually worked as a litigator on the Cow Palace litigation that we're going to touch on in a minute up in the state of Washington. So she has a lot of kind of those shared experiences. When I sat down and chatted with her, she came up with this, or she used the term agricultural exceptionalism. And I thought that really encapsulates what our problem is. They are above the law almost. Okay, so as we know, they're toxic. I don't think I have to sit here and tell you guys that CAFOs are toxic and how they're toxic. I'll let other people do that as well, but I think we all probably understand that. And then I also took health law in my second semester, my 3L year. And that's where I really learned what qui tam was. And then I had, in talking with Professor Matsumoto, she's like, I don't know why we haven't used that in animal law before. And so that kind of is what caused my research to shift gears. And so we know that CAFOs are subsidized by taxpayers. We put a lot of our money into protecting the industry. And so somebody up here said, if you're passionate about tax law, I think it was Jamie said, if you're passionate about tax law, focus on that, because you can use that to help animals. Well, I'm going to talk about a way to do that here, because qui tam feeds right into that. So there's many ways that CAFOs are funded. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program provides funding. Department of Agriculture underwrites pollution with conservation funds in the ways of like manure lagoons, animal mortality facilities, manure management. FEMA disaster funds. They're getting disaster funding, and they have to abide by the rules when they accept it. Coronavirus, so the CARES Act. Farming industry collected $32.2 billion in pandemic spending. That's a lot of money that you can look at. So there's been a variety of ways of approaching this issue, trying to combat the toxicity of CAFOs. And so I'm going to propose, or I'm sorry, we're going to talk first about whack-a-mole. So, and I put this in here specifically for Priscilla because she liked this the best out of thing in my paper was the term whack-a-mole, because it feels like as animal law practitioners, as soon as you get a win, it's like the politicians come in and, you know, it's like whacking the mole and batting it down, right? And so as soon as you get a win, boom, they're hitting it again and it pops up, you know, you get another win somewhere. So for instance, with that Cow Palace litigation that was up in Washington State, as soon as that litigation was over, Representative Newhouse from Washington, his response was not to help the people that were affected by this or the animals, not to, you know, do anything in regard to that, but to make it harder to sue for plaintiffs that were affected by the pollution from agricultural operations. That was immediately what he went to. So what happened with the Cow Palace was they were able to show, or they were able to use RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, to say that manure and the outputs of a CAFO are toxic waste. So then immediately what happens? the legislator decides that he wants to try to make it so that animal manure and whatnot isn't included in a RCRA. Another example is after the Smithfield lawsuits in North Carolina, what the North Carolina legislature did was they amended the right to farm law for the fourth time, because they have to keep amending it every time that, you know, we get a win, in 2018 to address a vulnerability in the law exposed by such litigation. So, so once again, whack-a-mole. So maybe instead of going after the toxic outputs of CAFOs, maybe we should be looking at going into the funds that are flowing into them. So this is where the possible new approach comes in. And this was the False Claims Act was a product of the Civil War. You can see there where it's codified. And what it does is it involves those that are in the know that CAFOs are not doing what they said they would do in order to get federal funding, bringing KTAM actions against them. So KTAMs, well, let me get the Latin here. KTAM is, and I'm probably going to mangle it. KTAM pro domino rege quam pro cipso. But let's just go back to English, and that means he who is much for the king is for himself. And so this came from the Middle Ages, when the king would give a reward to someone so he went out and enlisted the public in order to help police violations of the law, and then would reward the people. So that's where this all came from. And so to get to the Civil War part, during the Civil War, President Lincoln was disgusted by defense contractors that were cheating the US government that were providing supplies for the war. So the False Claims Act was passed. The first version of it was passed. So in this case, it includes the FCA, False Claim Act, includes a provision, a KTAM provision that allows individual citizens with knowledge of fraud against the government to initiate suit against those who are committing the fraud. So that means that if any one of us was involved with a CAFO and we had knowledge that they were doing something that was violating the promises that they made to the government when they accepted federal funding, we could initiate the lawsuit against them. So all of us who've taken Con Law 1, and those of you 1Ls I saw in the room that you will take it next semester likely, one of the big things is standing. That was my first thing, was how do you have standing? How can you go after them? So in this case, a standing is conferred on that private person who's termed a relator. That's your vocabulary lesson for the day. Because they're looking for a redress of the government's injury, and they get a portion of what is recovered. So that's how the standing is conferred. So that was kind of one of those things I was like, I don't get that. Okay, now I get it a little bit better. So in addition to the Federal False Claims Act, over 25 states and the District of Columbia also have KTAM laws or False Claims Act laws at the state level too. Oh, and let's see, there's roughly 650 KTAM lawsuits filed under False Claims Act each year, just to kind of give you an idea on that. So the substantive aspects of a KTAM lawsuit, this is all codified. Knowledge. So section 3729 outlines 7 ways that show that there was knowledge to establish liability. Don't have to show intent though. So go back to your crim law. So you think knowledge, you know, you go through the different ways of knowing. Don't have to show intent. So that's a good thing. Falsity. So after a case called Escobar, there's 3 types of falsity. So you either have to show that there was actual or objective falsity, meaning they falsified something to the government. Right now they're litigating over what is objective, right? I mean, because we have to litigate. I mean, otherwise we won't have jobs. So, and that has to do maybe a difference of opinion. Is a difference of opinion objective? And so that's just an area where they're litigating now. Legal falsity might be dealing with compliance with laws, regulations, and fraudulent inducement. We have materiality. So State Farm v. Rigsby says that It must be material to the government's payment decision in order to be actionable under the False Claims Act. So we have to look at the government's purpose for providing the funds. So if we look back to the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, which CAFOs were eligible for as of the 2002 Farm Bill, those are to improve water quality, to boost soil health, and to preserve ecosystems. So if CAFOs are doing something that violates one of those purposes, the materiality aspect is met. And then the damages, the amount of damages awarded to a relator has to do with multiple factors. Did the government intervene? What role did the relator take in the litigation? Was the relator involved in actions that led to defrauding the government? Were they ones that started, then they turned around and became a whistleblower? So those all kind of go into the damages aspect. Procedural aspects of a KTAM lawsuit. We're going to talk about these later, so I'm not going to go into much detail right now. One of them, basic civil procedure, 9B, FRCP 9B. If you're pleading fraud, you have to state with particularity. So there's special pleading requirements. There's a public disclosure bar. The information can't be available to the public. Government dismissal authority. This is a big one right now. On what grounds can the government dismiss the case, even if they don't intervene? So let's look at what it takes to initiate a KTAM lawsuit. And there's different ways to say it, KTAM, KTAM, KTOM. They're all accepted. So if we're initiating a KTAM lawsuit, so I'm going to use a little example here. There's a precedent for a KTAM lawsuit when you're dealing with natural disaster dollars. So if we go back to Hurricane Katrina, the Archdiocese of New Orleans, as well as Xavier University, applied for funding through FEMA. But one of the guys working on it, our relator, Mr. Romero, realized that, hey, that wasn't damaged by Hurricane Katrina, but here they're claiming that it was. So he went and he filed suit as a relator, saying that, so he's a private citizen with the evidence, filed suit in a proper US district court. It's filed in camera, so it's filed, what's the word I'm looking for? Of course, I can't think of it. It can't be disclosed publicly. So it's filed with just the judge. And so it can't be disclosed. And so it has to remain under seal and not be disclosed for 60 days. That's giving the government a chance to take a look at it and decide if it wants to intervene or not. Government has 60 days to investigate, decide whether to intervene. If the government intervenes, they take over the case, but the relator will still get a portion of what's recovered. If the government doesn't intervene, the relator may pursue the case on their own. So you can still move forward with the case and get a higher percentage as well. There is also a provision for a protection from retaliation. So in the case, in the thing with CAFOs, many times people in the communities are working at the CAFOs, the ones with the knowledge, the ones that would be the relators, they're working for them, their family members working for them. They might rely on them for their day-to-day living. So there is a whistleblower protection that is a part of the FCA as well. So this is very cursory. Hopefully it kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like, okay? So risks and rewards. So I think Brian and Scott, anybody here that deals with the legislature, deals with politics, knows that when you get a new administration in, the political climate changes, right? So you have one administration putting out executive orders, memos, whatever else, and then you have a new administration and they're going to change priorities and whatever. So always have to be careful with that. You need to really look before you leap and make sure you understand. What was interesting is there was a memo put out that the Granston memo that was DOJ guidance, and this memo was leaked, and it basically told everybody what, because this comes down more to the government dismissal power, it told everybody what the government was looking for when it came to trying to dismiss KTAM lawsuits. So the government does have a dismissal power. That's a risk you're taking. If the government chooses not to intervene and you choose to go forward, the government can go to the court and try to say, nope, we don't want this to move forward. The court has to rule on it, of course. And the circuits are split on that, whether they take what the DOJ says and run with it, DC Circuit, or they take it and look at all of the circumstances, which I believe Ninth Circuit is doing that. So it really depends. But some of those things that were in the Granstad memo about the government dismissal power, things for them to look at were, what's the merit of the claim? Is there a duplicity of claims? Does it interfere with agency policies or programs? So you can see where they can get that one, right? The political climate changes. Oh, we don't like that. It doesn't go with our policy anymore. Interference with ongoing litigation, disclosure of classified information, weighing the burden of the claim against the expected gain, and frustrating the investigation of the claim. So those are all some things where the government does have the power to dismiss, and then it's up to the court to make that decision, but that is a risk. And another thing with that is there is a Garland memo that came out, and that talks about the use of guidance documents from agencies. So when you accept funding from the agency, are you only bound by what's in statute and in the regulations? Or will guidance documents, can those be used to show that you're not using the money in the way you're supposed to be as well? Some different defenses. We talked about FRCP 9B, the heightened pleading requirements. Public disclosure bar. If the information is out in the public, you can't tell the government about it. It's already out there, so you can't be a relator. So that bars you from that. First to file bar. Make sure all your ducks are in a row, but be the first one to file that KTAM lawsuit, because if you're the second one, there might be a way to get in on it, but not likely. Maybe you've got some extra really good information, but don't count on it. Statute of limitations, 6 years, but if the government didn't know when it happened, then there's caveats to statute of limitations, but make sure you understand those. And then ethical considerations. I mean, if you're asking your relator, so if you're working with someone, you're asking them to go and get confidential information from their employer, that type of thing can cause issues as well. Financial pros and cons. Obviously, a percentage of proceeds would be very beneficial, right? So if we go back to the Archdiocese case I talked about with, I can't remember the name of my relator now, Mr. Romero, he received approximately $199,500. So that was a nice, so he only got, a portion of it. The government got back a lot more, obviously. So that's a huge pro. You can get treble damages. So with treble damages, if it's pretty egregious, the government could go after 3 times what the damages were. And then if you prevail, you can get reasonable expenses, attorney's fees, and costs, which of course, especially if you're a nonprofit or individual, that's huge to be able to collect on that. Some of the cons, well, the cost of litigation, should you not prevail, that would include if the government decides to dismiss. And it does fall under the 8th Amendment excessive fines clause. So they could find that whatever you're awarded was excessive, and that could be decreased as well. So if you're looking to see what a successful KTAM action might look like, you have a competent relator. I mean, if you have a relator that just kind of wishy-washy, might not be an easy suit. You're going to need really good documentation. There's some discovery work that you have to do that's pretty intense. Needs to be in line with the government enforcement priorities. You need to make sure that you have a good roadmap and you know where you're going. So it's organization. It's the 5 Ps: prior planning prevents poor performance. Kind of goes with this here. And you need solid partnerships with the government agencies. Be able to work with them. And that's what I have for you. And I have to leave you with my little fur babies up here. So Tucker's looking up at me, and his sister is stealing the bone. And then I have my dapper dudes over here. One other thing I thought about, so, and I'm just throwing this in there as an added little piece. Another area of animal advocacy is obviously trying to get animals out of labs. And so I kind of thought about the primate centers, the one in Oregon here, up at the University of Washington, and just the horrendous things that they do to the primates that they have in there. So there are qui tam cases for scientific research, and they involve the liability of hospitals and universities for false information provided to obtain federal funding for research. They generally involve the reimbursement of research expenditures by hospitals conducting federally funded medical research or universities with research grants from the National Institute of Health. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I kind of found that along the way as well, that it's another way to think about using this tool moving forward. So thank you all.
Good afternoon. It's afternoon, right? Yep. Good afternoon. All right, so my name is Daria Bednarczyk, and I am a JD candidate at Vermont Law and Graduate School. However, since everybody else kind of gave a little background about themselves, when I initially started this workshop, I was actually a master's student. And this past summer, I graduated from Vermont Law School with my master's of environmental law and policy. And I fell in love with animal law and the issues that are going on currently within the animal sector, that I decided to continue this education and pursue my JD in animal law. So you guys are going to be able to see the work that I did as a master's student, but now with the knowledge of my first semester of JD classes. So the project that I will be presenting to you today is entitled Behind Closed Doors: The Fettered Lives of Farm Animals and the Deficits of Legal Protection Afforded to Farm Animals in Natural Disasters. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on hurricanes. And so together we're going to go through this because my presentation is more geared towards new people coming into the animal law field who may not know all of the intricacies of the various laws that are currently on the books on both the federal and state level. So this is kind of for people who are either in high school or first year of law school, or just the general public that may not have the baseline knowledge to fully understand the animal law field and what is going on, especially on CAFOS. So to begin, what I'll be talking to you about today is an overall introduction of CAFOS. And like Trish had said, the definition for CAFOS, or rather the acronym, stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. I personally did not know that coming into it. So in the event some of you didn't know, now we know, because we will be hearing that term throughout this presentation. Following that, we will be talking about big storms and extreme weather events. And in my case, we'll be talking about hurricanes in North Carolina specifically, and how those storms negatively impact CAFOS. Then we will move on to the current laws that are on the books that are intended to help farm animals, both on the federal and state level. And we will follow that up by small changes with big impact, because most of those changes actually do start at the local level. So let's begin. And just because we did mention mental health prior to this, I would like to note there are a few pictures on my slides that could be a little disturbing or upsetting. I can always let you guys know when those are coming up. I just don't want anybody to get upset, but I am forewarning you that there are some pictures to highlight the atrocities on these farms. So as I said, we're going to start off with just big ag. What is big ag and what are these CAFOs? What are we all talking about here? So to begin, when most people hear the word farm, what do they think of? We all grew up with Old MacDonald Had a Farm. You think of those green grasses, cows grazing on pasture, roosters crowing, the iconic red barn and John Deere tractor. And these farms are typically filled with what we were told were happy animals, right? However, in today's society, that imagery is just so far from the truth. We will be discussing how beginning in the mid, I believe 1900s, animals began to be housed on these concentrated animal feeding operations, which are also called factory farms. They have many names for them, but I'll probably be using CAFO or factory farm interchangeably. And the industrialization of agriculture really changed the convention of agribusiness. And this ended up causing a lot of concerns for US citizens that are in the agricultural industry. So we're gonna really harp on what a CAFO is. So as we said, CAFO stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. And to provide you with a textbook example and a textbook definition of what these farms are. They are a farm on which a large number of livestock are raised indoor conditions, so not outside on those lovely pastures we all think. And the conditions that they're housed inside are intended to maximize profits at a minimal cost. So we can already see right here, just based on this definition alone, we are not considering these animals sentient beings, but rather commodities. We forget that there are lives behind these animals who are being enclosed in intense confinement indoors. And one of the most important statements, in my opinion, when doing this research, was a statement made by ex-former Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz. He was a huge proponent of the industrialization of agriculture. And what he told small farmers under, he was the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Gerald Ford. And he told small farmers, you need to get big or you need to get out. America needs industrial farms to keep up with the need for meat products, animal products, dairy products to feed our citizens. So if you are a small scale local farmer and if you don't adapt, basically you need to find somewhere else to work because you don't fit in within these confines of industrial agriculture. And another really big issue that will be discussed throughout this presentation is that we have learned the term agricultural exceptionalism. This essentially allows the industry to police itself. And one of the ways that they police themselves is by the use of what are called customary practices. These are the husbandry and handling practices that are used and forced upon these animals in a daily, on a daily regular basis. However, the difference is, even though they are considered customary, if these same practices and handling techniques, they were used on our companion animals, say at home, they would be deemed animal cruelty and animal abuse. But the difference here is these animals are being used and raised for human consumption and food and fiber. And therefore, since it's a customary practice for that industry, it's not necessarily considered abuse or cruelty. So to move on, I will be discussing some of the harmful practice to give you an overview of these customary, common, natural practices that agricultural industries are allowed to get away with, which other sectors of animal industries would not be able to get away with. So here are the few horrors that animals on factory farms experience on a daily basis. They include the thumping of piglets for size control, the force feeding of ducks and geese for foie gras. We have tail docking, teeth clipping, dehorning, which is also called besputting, castration, debeaking, the maceration of male chicks, extreme confinement, which is really one of the biggest issues that we'll be talking about today, the breaking up of families, and finally cannibalization or cannibalism. So moving on, this is where I'm going to actually show you some images. So fair warning, we're going to see those. Okay. So here on the left, we can see a calf that is being forcefully handled. And I can't imagine anybody in this room would be okay with throwing a calf into a wheelbarrow for whatever reason. And I can also assume, without knowing what was happening in this instance, that this calf was prematurely ripped away from its mother. So when I mentioned earlier, the breaking up of families, well, this calf, regardless of where it is going or what its intended use is, whether it's veal or who knows what, you don't handle animals in that manner. And on the right here, we see what is called a battery cage. Battery cages are these small wire enclosures where typically egg-laying hens are forced into, and they may pack as many as 10 birds into one of these cages for shipment and housing. But when you stuff 10 birds into such a small enclosure, and I believe I keep hearing the comparison to the sheet of a paper, like a printer paper, that is about the size of the wire enclosure that they're housed in. Now imagine 10 full-size birds fitting into one sheet of paper. That's atrocious. And these small confinements do not allow any of these birds to demonstrate or exhibit any of the natural behaviors they would do if they were not confined in these closures. And it prevents them from even spreading out their wings or standing up without hitting one of their cage mates. And oftentimes it results in harm or some kind of mutilation when trying to fight for that space in order to have some sort of, you can't even call it comfort, but just to stay alive within that cage. So the next slide will have another disturbing image, just fair warning. So here we see a piglet that is having its tail docked, and for the reason that a lot of farms do this is they claim that by tail docking the animals, it helps prevent them from self-mutilating, but also from mutilating other cage mates. And unfortunately, a lot of these practices are often done with any anesthetic or any type of pain relief. So you can imagine how terrifying it must be to one of the piglets to not understand what's going on, but also not being given any type of anesthesia to help you cope with the mutilation that's being done to you to prevent you from further harming you or from further mutilating yourself. Doesn't make sense to me. And then finally here on the right, I talked about force feeding and the word foie gras. It is what people call a delicacy in which geese and ducks are force fed on a daily basis. And the point of it is to enlarge their livers to what is typically 10 times the normal size for human consumption. And I can't imagine that this is comfortable to be done to you on a daily basis. So I promise some of the images aren't as disturbing, but I will let you know when the last one comes up. Okay, so let's move on to the hurricanes that I'll be talking about and why this is important with regards to climate change. So what happens when a hurricane hits a CAFO, which we've learned about has such intense confinement and massive number of animals on their farms on any given basis? Well, a lot of CAFOs are located on what are known as floodplains, meaning they are so prone to flooding, and this puts them at great risk of obviously having the floods impact the animals that are being locked up in intensive confinement on these farms. And if you think about emergency plans for a place like a CAFO, well, depending on the number of animals you have on that farm, and especially if it's a CAFO that deals with poultry, they can have millions and millions of birds on one farm. There is no feasible way to evacuate that number of animals in the time done before a storm hits. So because of this, unfortunately, there is this policy called closing the barn doors. And it is just so sad to me to hear that a lot of these farmers know that the intensive confinement and the sheer number of animals on their farms, there's no way to evacuate them. And they don't have emergency plans set in place to help relocate these animals to help survive the storm. So the best option is to just lock them in their pens, shut those barn doors, go home to your family where you can take shelter, and leave these animals to fend for themselves within their locked cages. And even the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and I'll be speaking more about North Carolina shortly here, has said that many of the animals on these farms do end up drowning in their own cages because they have no way else to get out. And when hurricanes hit these CAFOs and the barn doors are closed, you can imagine there is immense loss of life. But since this industry does not view these animals as sentient beings and more so as commodities, the death toll is often not reported or underreported. So any number of deaths that we have are just estimates, because I have read several reports where people are asking, well, what was the impact on the farm? Not once do they mention lives or animals. They say it was a financial loss. It was, we lost a few commodities. They don't put a living sentient being behind their products. So to them, it's just the cost of doing business. And finally, I have here location on private property. Well, because CAFOs are so tight-lipped and we've heard about ag laws, a lot of these farms are located on private property. So even if you wanted to go in and you wanted to get an estimate of the total death toll of animals after a hurricane were to hit CAFO, you'd have to trespass. And luckily we have had undercover animal investigators go in and try to gauge the true devastation following these storms. And it has given us more realistic numbers, but that just gives us one more obstacle that we have to jump in order to really understand how these hurricanes and other extreme weather events cause havoc on these farms and cause so much pain and suffering. Bless you. So I wanted to focus on North Carolina. And North Carolina is of particular interest to me because they have a large number of CAFOs. And I believe it's actually really difficult to gauge how many CAFOs there are. But lately, or somewhat recently, I did see that there are upwards of between 2,000 and 2,300 CAFOs within the state. And that's important because North Carolina is the fourth most hurricane-prone state. It has a very large coastline filled with floodplains, and you guessed it, that's where all the CAFOs are located. And there are so many storms I can talk about, but I decided to focus on hurricanes Dennis and Floyd in 1999. There were two compounding storms that hit North Carolina one after the other. And following these storms, the few people that reported on the loss of animal lives were able to estimate that there was a loss of about 2.4 million chickens lost, 500,000 turkeys, and around 100,000 hogs. That's astounding, right? But if you look at hurricanes that have hit the state since, such as Florence, these numbers have doubled in some of the cases. So you can see the loss of life of poultry for up to being 5 million birds. What do? How do you evacuate those animals? You can't, right? So to highlight Hurricane Dennis and Floyd, it was known as the flood of the century, like a 500-year storm. And as was spoken to earlier, not only does this devastate the animals on the farm, but people within the communities, the wildlife, the environment surrounding these farms. And when the floods go through these CAFOs, there are so many chemicals and antibiotics and manure that is seeping through the ground and leaking through runoff, and it is destroying these communities. And one local resident in North Carolina actually compared the smell and the devastation following Dennis and Floyd as causing an environmental witch's brew. And it just caused destruction everywhere it went, and it affected wildlife, humans surrounding the area. Children were a huge problem when it came to a lot of the pollution surrounding the local residents after the storm. And obviously the animals themselves on the CAFOs. Well, what do you do when this massive amount of animal life is lost? This is now posing a new environmental and health threat when we have all of these decomposing carcasses that are scattered throughout the state. Well, the devastation was so intense that North Carolina actually had to bring incinerators from out of state that were running 24/7. And I do not have the statistic of how long they were running for, but they were running all night, every night, and burning between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds of animal remains per hour. And that's from the animals that they could actually locate, because a lot of them were submerged following the flooding of the storm. So here I want to talk to you about, well, how will climate change make things worse? We hear about climate change all the time and how our global temperature is rising. Well, what will this do to CAFOs and the animals living on them? Well, the trends of storms are intensifying. They are becoming more widespread and more volatile. This will increase the amount of rainfall and therefore flooding that will put these animals' lives at risk on a daily basis. And as stated here, 2018 was the wettest year on record for North Carolina with about 104 inches of rain, and a lot of that was due to Hurricane Florence. And here we see this picture. I think it's quite powerful. During Hurricane Florence, there was a lot of animals fighting for porch space on any local resident's property in order to escape the flooding waters. And a lot of residents would see cows fighting for porch space just to find some sort of solace and shelter, right? And with our warming climate, this is always just going to become a bigger problem if nothing is done. And the harm that is seen on CAFOs, especially with this flooding and not being able to rehouse this number of animals, will just be exacerbated by a warming climate with more rainfall. And another thing I'd like to add is when we talk about climate change, we always hear about greenhouse gases. Well, with increases in greenhouse gases, that's only going to continue to warm our climate. However, one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases is industrial agriculture. So that is another reason, if not only for the horrific harm and abuse and welfare and handling of animals, but also for ourselves and our climate and the impacts that follow what these greenhouse gas emissions will do to the other parts of our environment, you know, the environmental part, the human aspect. Like was said earlier, these are all interrelated areas of the law. So we really need to focus on decreasing the number of industrial agricultural farms, because by doing so, we can hopefully reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that they are emitting and warming our climate. So now that I've given you a brief overview of what CAFOs are, well, what current laws are on the books on the federal and state level that are intended to help these animals? Well, we have a few here that I've listed. However, I'm going to highlight just a few of these. The 28-hour law. That is one of the only laws currently on the federal level that protects animals that are on factory farms. However, they do not protect farmed animals while they are living on these CAFOs. It is only implemented once they are being transported off of the farm and probably more likely than not off to slaughter. And even then, the requirements for their welfare, such as bedding, water, rest breaks, aren't necessarily enough. So that's one I wanted to highlight. Next, the Animal Welfare Act. I'm sure a lot of us have heard of that. It's one of the largest overarching laws protecting our animals. However, not always covering all of the livestock that are living on CAFOs. And the final act I really want to highlight is the PETS Act, the Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. That was enacted actually following Hurricane Katrina. Citizens were so distraught over the loss of animal lives following Katrina, and they wanted government to do something. So they created the PETS Act to help with preparedness and preparing animals when storms hit. However, the one downside to this is it only protects companion animals. It really has its niche group of species that are covered by it. So if you're an animal that's living on a farm, it's not going to help you. So we need to see what else we can do to make sure animals on farm have greater protection. Well, since the federal level isn't cutting it, well, what are states doing? Animal cruelty is a crime in all 50 states, and the prosecution varies between state to state. And often when you look at state laws and you look at the definition of animal and animal cruelty and animal abuse, the one thing that you'll notice is the definition of animal is different in all of those regulations and those statutes. And unfortunately, some of those laws are worded so ambiguously that livestock are sometimes left out of those protections. So those animal cruelty and animal abuse statutes that are meant to protect animals aren't always including livestock on farms. So finally, I want to move on to some small changes that can have great impact on animals living on farms. Future changes, ballot initiatives. The first ballot initiative that was successfully implemented to help increase the welfare and living conditions of livestock on farms took place in the state of Florida in 2002. And it was stated that over half of Florida voters supported the initiative. And I'm really hoping right now, for some people in this room, you guys might be thinking of what's currently going on with the Supreme Court case dealing with Prop 12 and the banning or limiting the use of gestation crates and the transportation of meat that might have been improperly housed using a gestation crate. So we really need to be following that. That's a really exciting thing. Hopefully we get good results so that we can have hope for the future here. But the Farm Bill, I believe that Trish had mentioned the Farm Bill. That is a huge bill, huge omnibus multi-layer bill. And if you try to understand it, you will see that animal agriculture, animal protection, animal welfare isn't really mentioned throughout that bill. So I'm thinking, even though it might be challenging, it'll take persistence, but it is a viable option to try to reform that Farm Bill and to try to get some sort of animal welfare and some kind of animal regulation regarding husbandry and day-to-day practices to try to get more protection for these animals under the Farm Bill. Finally, I think this is the easiest one, and this was also mentioned earlier, change in diet. In order to help these animals to reduce the number of animal slaughters every year that are slaughtered for human consumption, to reduce the pain and suffering of these animals, that will also ultimately reduce the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted by these CAFOs, is to decrease the amount of animal products we are eating. This does not require going fully vegan. If you want to become, I believe it's called flexitarian, just be more cognizant of the meat that you are purchasing and try to just reduce it a little bit. It doesn't take full-fledged veganism to make a really big impact on these animals' lives. And finally, I wanted to highlight something exciting that was passed just last month. So I didn't know about this when I was studying my project, but on October 17th, there was a bipartisan bill that was passed called Planning for Animal Wellness Act. And that act intends to go over the best practices and evacuation plans for animals that are held in captivity. This act gives me high hope. However, the one thing that I have noticed is that in the text of the act, it says that it is intended to help captive animals. However, the act fails to define what a captive animal is. But in the introduction of that act, it does mention livestock. So I'm hoping that once that act is actually implemented in our future, we will see that not only livestock will be protected by it, but animals being held on zoos, within aquariums, roadside zoos, everybody that's typically forgotten when it comes to the law. So what I hope that you've been able to take away from this so far is that CAFOs are obviously very unsustainable and horrific institutions. We cannot continue to let agricultural exceptionalism police themselves, and we need to band together as animal advocates to show the people around us that these are atrocities that are taking place every day in our communities. And so many of us, like myself, when I first came into this schooling and profession, I didn't know it was occurring. And like I mentioned earlier, through the use of ballot initiatives, a lot of the big change can begin at the local level. So even though we are small, we are large in numbers. And by banding together, we really can make some drastic and amazing change. And even if it doesn't happen now, it may happen in the future, that we do see that the lives of these animals will be improved. This is the last sad image, I promise. But I really wanted to show you guys, this is a cow that had recently been dehorned or disfetted. And I think this is a very powerful quote. But climate change is on the rise. And if nothing is done to change these daily practices, the lack of emergency disaster planning, then these animals will continue to be the forgotten victims when natural disaster strikes. We need to urge our legislature and compel these CAFOs to be held accountable for their atrocious and horrific practices that they're able to get away with because the lack of legislation requiring them to provide these animals with the respect and the welfare that they ultimately deserve as sentient beings that we rely so heavily on. And before I finish, I would just like to thank the LDF for letting me be here with you today. It was so fun and such an honor to speak with you guys, as well as my mentors at Vermont Law Graduate School, in particular, Professor Delciana Winders and Miss Laura Ireland. And We Animals Media, if you guys have not heard of them, all of the pictures from my presentation were Joanne MacArthur. If you haven't heard of her, she's a photojournalist. She allowed me to use her captivating imagery to really hone in and reveal the daily atrocities that these animals go through. But on a happy note, we have some farm animals on sanctuary that Joanne so incredibly documented. And I am so thankful to all of you. And thanks, Mom, for being here and supporting me. So thank you all. And I hope you got something from this.
Thank you so much, Trish and Daria, for those the wonderful presentations. They were so informative and insightful. I believe there was a question asked earlier about whether anyone's keeping track of how many farmed animals are lost during natural disasters and they die during them. And I think your presentation really addressed that question as well. So we don't have a lot of time, but we're open for questions. So we can take one question for each speaker. If anybody has any.
Hi, I'm Morgan Boutier. I'm a 3L at UCLA. And I'm not sure who would like to speak on this, but both of you mentioned agricultural exceptionalism in your presentations. And I was wondering, given like the food supply chain disruptions that we saw during the pandemic and that are still ongoing, I'm wondering if either of you have come across in your research that has given leverage to big ag in their position that they should be exempted from all these laws and allowed to police their own behavior.
Did you catch that? Can you repeat part of the question? Sorry, it's a little hard to hear.
Do you mind taking your mask off?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was wondering if you have seen big ag using the food supply chain disruptions that we saw during COVID-19 as leverage for their position that they should be exempted from environmental laws and allowed to police themselves.
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to take it?
Go for it, yeah.
So that's a really good question. And because CAFOs are so tight-lipped, one thing that I found most disturbing is when these storms hit, a lot of farmers actually value their crops more than their animals. And so when people hear that a storm is coming, rather than trying to figure out how to clear out their animals, nope, they go right to harvesting their crops. And so that just goes to show you this is a money deal. And I'm sure this will be spoken about in the next panel, but there's something called the Livestock Indemnity Program. And essentially that is allowing farmers to get away with letting their animals either drown or succumb to infection or asphyxiation because they can claim insurance payouts from that. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but it's like the only industry that is allowed to not adhere to like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or even right to farm laws. There are lack of lawsuits that are able to make nuisance claims against these farmers because a lot of the money is coming from these larger industries. And if you really look into it, you'll also see that the American Vet Medical Association even is making up a lot of these customary definitions. So you can see that it's really a collaborative effort in allowing these large agricultural industries to call the shots. And when people need, like people in legislation need any type of definition or help with planning for future, they fall back on the people who are already in the industry. So the people who are perpetuating the problem are also giving advice on how they should run their own industry. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
The questions?
This question is for Trish. I'm wondering with the defenses, how likely do you think if someone was to bring something, say, you know, a factory farm didn't take mitigation efforts and they have information to bring to the government about a loan or something like that. Do you think the likelihood that the government would actually succeed in that with the defenses? Or do you think with the animal politics behind it, that the defenses would be enough to just be like, we're not even going to listen to what you have to say?
I could only catch part of that. I'm sorry. I don't know, it's like distorted or something. So you're talking about the defenses for, oh, that's fine.
What industry back and say, you know, oh, this is this. Do you think because of the politics surrounding animals that the likelihood to actually succeed is strong? Or do you think that they'll use those defenses as anything necessary to get out of any?
So the biggest area that they use KTAM loss or that you see KTAM lawsuits is in healthcare, and it's has to do with Medicare fraud. And so they would have to, it would almost be like we would be switching the whack-a-mole around, because they would be like having to change all of the funding sources. All these funding sources would have to change, and the requirements, the tax code would have to change, and the requirements. So it's kind of almost a reverse of where it is now, in that and the nice thing is you file it and it's the DOJ taking care of it, rather than like when you mentioned that, you know, the agencies, you know, I mean, it's the fox guarding the hen house. When you look at, you know, USDA, they go from industry to USDA to industry and back and forth and like type of thing. Well, in this case, you have the DOJ looking at it, and they're looking at the money. They're not necessarily looking at the fact that this is a CAFO. This is a protected, you know, agency or a protected industry. There we go, whatever. So I would see it as they would have to play catch up at least. But I would see it as a different, because you're going after the funding that they've received, and that's something where they sign saying that we are going to do this and this and this for this money. They would have to go back and totally change all of that. And you could go after so many different ways. I mean, you could go after tax credits. You could go after disaster funding. You could go after the EQIP funds. You could go after, you know, just anything where they're getting federal funds. One of the other things I thought about was Idaho just passed a state law that has to do with CAFOs and funding for CAFOs. But 40% of the project has to be funded from somewhere else. Are they taking federal dollars and using it improperly? You could go after that. So there's so many ways that you could go after it as well.
Thank you so much once again to our wonderful panelists.
I'm Nicole. I work in the animal law program at Animal Legal Defense Fund with Priscilla. And we're going to be presenting the Animal Legal Defense Fund Chapter of the Year Award now. This award celebrates chapters that have shown incredible efforts in advancing the field of animal law and advocating for animals through projects, events, and initiatives. Student chapters are a vital component of the growth in animal law, with student members raising awareness at their schools and in their communities, often leading the way for advancing the field of animal law, broadening the minds of their peers, and training to become incredible animal advocates and attorneys in their future careers. This year, I'm honored to present the Chapter of the Year Award to two chapters that truly exemplify a job well done. First is a chapter that came roaring back last year with both in-person and virtual events covering many different animal law topics. The Animal Legal Defense Fund George Washington Law School student chapter tabled, hosted documentary screenings, held panel events, and hosted fundraisers, while also creating space to engage their fellow students and to have some fun while doing it. Highlights include a very successful virtual event on racial justice and animal law that was co-hosted with the school's Black Law Students Association. A Cutest Animals contest, which raised over $1,100 for a local shelter. Vegan breakfast that introduced many to plant-based eating. And they became involved with the Animal Welfare Project's pro bono work, where students helped submit written testimony before the DC Council in support of a retail pet store sales ban. So we're very proud to award the George Washington Law School student chapter with the 2022 Chapter of the Year Award. Accepting the award on its behalf are Laura Mezzanotte, President, and David Brown, Vice President. Congratulations. This is the award. No pressure. We will pass. Thank you very much. The second chapter receiving the Chapter of the Year award is one that continues to build an incredibly strong community each year. The Animal Legal Defense Fund Florida State University College of Law student chapter had an incredibly busy year that included protests, speaker events, lobbying, movie nights, and holding the annual animal law writing competition with the Florida Bar Animal Law section and Pets Ad Litem. Student chapter members partnered with the Humane Society at the Florida Bar Animal Law section, at the Florida State Capitol to protect dogs from abuse in puppy mills. The chapter also partnered with the Environmental Law Society to raise awareness of the harmful impact of animal agriculture, hosting a screening and discussion of the documentary, Eating Our Way to Extinction. This year's writing contest winner wrote about how to support the declining population of Florida manatees by feeding them the invasive plants grown in rivers and streams. So we are very proud to award Florida State University College of Law student chapter with the 2022 Chapter of the Year Award. Accepting the award virtually on its behalf is Savannah Sherman, President. We will be mailing this award to them. Congratulations to the Florida State University College of Law student chapter. Congratulations again, and thank you so much to George Washington and Florida State for your impressive work, and to all of the Animal Legal Defense Fund student chapters for everything that you accomplish each year. So a round of applause for all of you. And
So it's my pleasure to introduce our law student scholarship panelists. First up, we have Jamie McLaughlin, LLM candidate at Lewis and Clark Law School. Second, we'll have Chitska Decker, a 3L at the University of Washington Law School, and Robin Burial, 3L at McGeorge School of Law. So please join me in welcoming Jamie.
This is where I'll view mines, and the clicker is here. This one. Hey, everybody. I noticed that we had lunch and then, we had the little ceremony and then we were having this talk right after. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. You're all super full and a little sleepy. And now I'm going to talk to you about finance and securities law. It's going to be great. I promise. I might ask for some class participation just to keep you awake. You never know. Okay, so as you know, I have a background in finance, and that was the inspiration for this. Just looking for different ways that we can help animals on CAFOs and climate disasters using just odd things. So this is kind of a novel idea. These rules have not been promulgated yet by the SEC, but for those of you that don't know what the SEC is, it's the Security and Exchange Commission. So they have some proposed ESG disclosure rules, and that stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. They will be possibly a way to bring investor lawsuits. The SEC should be enforcing it as an agency, and they've already started doing some enforcement. But this is a way for us to actually participate in lawsuits as investors as well. Okay, so this talk is going to have 3 parts. Basically, what I'm doing here is analyzing the potential to use these new SEC ESG rules to bring actions against public companies based on their non-disclosure or misstatement of their climate-related reporting standards. Part 1 is going to just, I mean, I know that you probably all know everything about ESG already, and this is like, you know, overkill. But part 1 is going to provide you some basic ESG information, talk about the impacts of greenwashing, the current ESG reporting landscape, and what the proposed disclosures look like. The second part is going to discuss the inclusion of emissions and pollution from climate disasters at CAPOs as a reporting item and the materiality reporting standard. And the third part, the wrap up, is going to just look at how we can actually analyze these disclosure requirements and how they can be applied to bring investor lawsuits against public companies where there's been a climate event that has led to CAPO related ESG or GHG emissions and pollution. Okay, so this is just a brief overview of what ESG is. So environmental, social, and governance factors are corporate reporting standards that indicate how a company addresses issues relating to non-financial criteria, such as their corporate governance, social matters, and environmental impact of that corporation or business. So some examples could be climate change, carbon emissions, air and water pollution, waste management, community relations, human rights, what they do for lobbying, how their board operates. ESG strategies seek to increase financial returns by analyzing material ESG considerations along with other material risks such as credit risk and counterparty risk. So this analysis is focusing on the environmental prong of ESG. There's a lot of different things that we could focus on here. And particularly because this project was about climate change and CAFOs. This does not mean that you should just only be thinking about ESG as the environment when you're trying to help animals. Because earlier, like I was talking about, all of these problems do not exist in a silo. They're integrated with each other. So when you're talking about social justice stuff, you could be looking at the labor and equal employment practices of a company when it comes to how they're dealing with their growers or slaughterhouse workers or things like that. And you might be able to focus on something like that as well. So don't just be thinking it's only about the environment. That just happens to be what I want to talk about today. Okay, so why are these ESG claims important? Why should it matter to us what these companies are saying about their environmental practices? That's because ESG assets are appealing to investors, and a lot of money is being put into companies' stocks and mutual funds that are groups of stocks that are claiming to have good ESG practices. It's a very hot area to invest in right now. Right now, this year, assets in ESG are probably going to surpass $41 trillion. And by 2025, it's estimated to be $50 trillion of investors' money going into products that are claiming to be ESG related. So there's a lot of money at stake here. Greenwashing occurs when a company promotes its environmental concerns, sort of like an advertising gimmick. They can do this by making misleading statements or omissions about their metrics and what they're doing. Material misstatements impact investors that are seeking returns that are based on the ESG reporting factors. Give you a moment to read that. So because up until this point, there's been no reporting standard, ESG factors are not being applied consistently. In many cases, they're misleading and they also lack transparency. And without a formal reporting framework, companies can make claims which are not consistent with their actual practices. So we've all seen big ag companies making claims how environmentally friendly they are, they treat their animals so well, but in the reality, we know that their practices are dictating high density industrial animal agriculture, like we saw earlier this morning, and they are not actually living up to these ESG claims. So the Securities and Exchange Commission is promulgating these new ESG rules. It was called the Enhancement and Standardization of Climate-Related Disclosures for Investors. It's about 500 pages of rule that came out in around May, and they had it open for comments. The comment period is closed. There's an anticipated final rule that might come out in December, hopefully at the earliest. Right now, the way it stands is that if you are a company and you don't make any ESG claims, you don't have to report to the SEC any of the environmental stuff that you're doing, unless, I mean, there's some exceptions like for big oil and stuff like that. But as long as you don't make an ESG claim, you don't have to report. However, if you do make an ESG claim, you have to report. So everybody was trying to figure out, okay, what is the SEC going to do with these ESG rules? There's been a lot of speculation because this is not a new thing. Globally, there are a lot of different types of reporting mechanisms and frameworks that have been set up and used in different countries or the EU. And so people were trying to figure out, okay, which way is the SEC going to go on this? And so they picked a reporting framework to model their rule after. And that was the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, that's a mouthful, as their reporting framework. And then they chose the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GHG protocol, that's going to serve as their greenhouse gas emission accounting and reporting model. So the GHG protocol standards and guidance are used globally. They're also used by the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States. And they incorporate some of the Kyoto Protocol gases, and those are listed here. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, et cetera. So the SEC's ESG rules are going to include this stuff. All right, so what are these scopes of emissions? So the GHG protocol uses this scope concept of emissions to figure out what type of emission it is and how much control the company has over it. So they're divided into 3 categories, and the reporting responsibility is directly linked to what the activity is and how much control the company has over it. So these are how they've defined it. So scope 1 are direct GHG emissions that occur from sources owned or controlled by the company. Owned or controlled. I want you to burn that on your brains. Repeat after me. Okay, ready? We're going to say owned and controlled on the count of 3. I told you I was going to have participation. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Owned or controlled. Okay, you're not going to forget that. Scope 2 emissions are those emissions primarily resulting from the generation of electricity purchased and consumed by the company. So these are not derived from their direct activities. They're from a third-party provider, so they're considered indirect. So let's say a business, I'm not going to name any specific big ag business, but they have corporate offices, right? And they need to keep the lights on. So that's an example, just like the power that they're taking to run their corporate office. Scope 3 emissions are also indirect, and they are basically anything that's not a scope 2. They're just defined as all other indirect emissions not accounted for in scope 2 emissions. These are the consequence of the company's activities, but are generated from sources that are neither owned or controlled by the company. So these scope categories are going to be really important in the next part of the presentation. That's why I want you to kind of be thinking about this and think scope 1 is anything that the company owns or controls. And none of this has been defined yet, right? Because these are new rules. So we're getting a chance to start thinking about how the SEC has laid this out and how we might be able to apply it for animals. And I know you're sitting here going, Jamie, this is so complicated. Why do we have to learn about ESG? Well, you don't really, but there are really no laws to protect farmed animals when it comes to their life on CAFO. You know, we've got the 28-hour law to transport them. We've got the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and stuff like that. But when the animal is there and we have some sort of climate disaster, whether that is a hurricane or maybe a very low temperature, whatever happens to them, and they're subjected to that, we don't have anything to protect them. And part of the problem actually was mentioned earlier with the close the barn doors mentality is that the US has this livestock indemnity program, And that actually pays producers when farmed animals die in excess of what the normal death rate is. So if you have a CAFO climate disaster and like all your animals die, well, that's in excess of the normal annual death rate. Now, they treat you different on how much they pay you based on whether you're a grower for big ag or if you actually own the animals yourself. So when you are an owner, your payment rate is calculated at 75% of the average fair market value of the animal, typically based on the nationwide price for that animal during the previous calendar year. So that's if you own your animals. But most CAFOs don't own their animals, right? These are contracted growers where big ag sends them the baby animals, they grow the animals, and then the animals go to slaughter, and big ag controls the slaughter process. So these growers that don't own the animals, but they contract with companies, they're treated completely differently. So growers receive a LIP payment that is equivalent to 75% of the average income loss sustained by the contract grower with respect to the dead livestock based on the type, class, and weight of the animal at the time of the eligible loss, condition, and death. Now, another difference is this. Owners can actually get a portion of what that fee would be if the animal is not dead, but just injured. So they get a smaller rate, but if they have an injured animal, they can still capitalize on that. But for growers, that is not the case. If a grower has an injured animal, it's worthless to them. They get nothing. If they can't slaughter it, it's worthless. So this is what really creates that close the barn doors mentality. Because if you've got a flood on a CAFO and you let all the animals out, well, you've got no dead bodies to count, you can't get your LIP money. But if you close the barn doors and let them all die, you just you got somebody in there, you know how many animals you had, then you get paid. And guess what? We all get to subsidize that. Thank you. Not really. So. All right. So these proposed SEC ESG rules are a potential tool for deterring this animal abandonment that I was talking about during climate disasters. So when a climate disaster would happen and you leave the animals there, they die. And we also know that there's these manure ponds and stuff that are outside. They can potentially overflow. The animal carcasses are going to decompose. All of this stuff creates GHG emissions. So it could be nitrogen, phosphorus, ammonia, pathogens, antibiotics, hormones. We all know that. And the leakage and runoff from the waste can really damage, you know, not just the environment, like communities, drinking water, all of those things will be impacted by this. Leakage and runoff from CAFO animal waste during climate disasters can be categorized as fugitive emission sources for GHG reporting factors. So the EPA warns that improper carcass disposal has a negative impact on human health and the environment. So who is responsible for CAFO fugitive emissions that occur during a climate disaster? So during a climate disaster, the CAFO animals are being held by contracted growers. So if you don't know much about how that process works, there's not any negotiation when it comes to these contracts. They have standardized contracts. They give them to the growers. You're either in or you're out. You don't get to say if you don't like these terms, and you're basically just subjected to whatever big ag wants to do. And how it stands now, without looking at the SEC's rules, when it comes to environmental laws, these contracts foist the responsibility for pollution from the CAFOs onto the grower. So while the big ag company writes the contract, tells them what feed to use, tells them what cages to use, tells them exactly how they have to run everything, and they know exactly where they're located, right? It's not a secret. They know it's on a floodplain. They know, where these contract growers are located. They control every aspect of it. Remember that? Own and control, own and control. Okay, so remember this that we just looked at? Okay, the proposed rules would require that companies identify emissions from sources that they own or control. So when we were talking about these growers, what is it? Where do you think that they fit? So they're not the electricity. I think Big Ag's going to try to say they're scope 3. We have no control over them and we don't own them. But I would argue they're scope 1 because these people have no ability to fight the contract with Big Ag. So they're stuck with whatever they're, told in the contract to do. Okay, so this is just explaining vertical integration a little bit in case you don't know how it works. Big Ag controls the entire process. So oftentimes what they do is they have the baby animals, they feed them, and they put together site protocols and all of that stuff. Then they send them to these contracted growers that are under contract to raise them to market weight. After that, Big Ag will pick them up and transport them to slaughter. And then most of the time, Big Ag owns these slaughter facilities where the animals are actually killed. So the ESG rules define this whole value chain here as having upstream and downstream activities related to a registrant's operations. So you can see that the contract grower is right in the middle of that. Upstream activities are those that occur earlier in the production process and include activities by a party other than the registrant that relate to the initial stages of the registrant's production of a good or service. And then downstream activities are those that occur later in the production process, defined to include activities by a party other than the registrant that relate to processing materials into a finished product and delivering it or providing service to the end user. So these large vertically integrated Big Ag companies control everything upstream and downstream. So I would argue that the contract growers are within their control as far as looking at the emission scopes and where they should fall. So under the proposed rules, a climate-related risk is the actual or potential negative impacts of climate-related conditions and the events on the registrant's consolidated financial statements, business operations, or value chains as a whole. So if they have any awareness that, like for example, if Big Ag owns a bunch of CAFOs that are all in the same floodplain, they know that it's flooded before, they're on notice that that could potentially be a climate disaster. It could cause all these extra GHGs, from the decomposing animals, the spillage of the manure ponds and all of that stuff. So that means that these fugitive emissions from growers could be categorized as scope 1, and they should be reported on the new SEC rules as soon as they come out. So in summary, future strategic impact litigation targeting climate disaster related ESG reporting could benefit investors, and it could indirectly help farmed animals by creating an incentive not to let them die in these horrific ways, because it's going to hurt the company with their financial reporting if they want to make ESG claims. This means that fugitive emissions from CAFOs that are the result of climate disaster should be classified as scope 1 under the new SEC rules. And Big Ag needs to report this because it's material information under the reporting scheme. If Big Ag misrepresents or omits material ESG info, investors can hold them accountable through private right of action, such as investor lawsuits. And then we can also bring other lawsuits just to make the SEC enforce against them on an administrative level. So thanks. There's my contact info, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. And I look forward to your questions pretty soon.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Chitska Decker. I'm a 3L at the University of Washington in Seattle. I want to start by sharing just a little bit more about me. I've always been really passionate about animals. The first thing I did in this arena was actually in high school. I volunteered at the Woodland Park Zoo. I know how we feel about zoos, but it was a good experience for me at the time, and I learned a lot about local wildlife and animal conservation issues, and also got over some of my youthful shyness. So very thankful to the zoo for that. I only finally went vegan at the same time I started law school. So I'm going on 2 years now, and I'm very happy with my decision to align my actions with my ethics. And I think every day I'm more sure that I made the right choice, and it gets easier. Plug for veganism there. in law school, I restarted the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter at UW, which had sort of faded away in the past. And we did some fun stuff last year. We toured an animal sanctuary and plan to do more this year. And then when I graduate, I'm going to be here in Portland, clerking in the federal district court. So Portland people, come say hi. I'm in the market for friends. Okay, so my paper is titled "Any Emergency Assistance for Animal Deaths Caused by Extreme Weather Events Should Be Conditional on Disaster Precautions." So that's the whole thing. That's my point. I'm focusing on the livestock indemnity program, and I think that we need some more conditions in there before we just write blank checks to farmers to receive assistance for animal deaths. To do this, I compare the livestock indemnity program to other federal statutory indemnity programs. I'm trying to find examples of conditions that we could port over. And then I also try to compare indemnity programs to other forms of subsidies. My basic argument is that subsidies and indemnity programs have the power to shape behavior. We have natural incentives for livestock growers and owners to adapt to climate risks because climate change is making climate events, weather events, more frequent and more severe. But when we have a program that's compensating livestock growers for losses, we're blunting that organic incentive. That doesn't make sense from like responsibility with taxpayer money, right, point of view. And then also it doesn't make sense for the animals, of course, which is why we're here. A little bit more on the livestock indemnity program for everyone. It provides benefits to livestock producers for animal deaths caused by adverse weather. Adverse weather could mean a lot of different things, wildfires, floods, winter storms. It has to be weather that's outside of the ordinary. And then to be eligible, the deaths caused by a weather event also have to be outside normal expected annual mortality. So when a livestock owner or farmer applies for assistance after an event, we ask them to provide some documentation of their animal population, the weather event, and the deaths of their animals. I will flag here that there is some language in the act saying that the deaths should be absent normal preventative measures or good farming practices, but that's not defined and we don't ask farmers for information about those measures. So it's kind of empty as it stands today. And then here, I think Jamie covered this, the rate at which farmers expect to be compensated. So I started by looking at different agricultural assistance programs. These all exist to aid the industry where costs of insurance or risk of loss is really high. And these are all run by the same agency that runs the LIP, that's the Farm Service Agency. And I was just looking for examples of where these programs do more than the LIP does. One is the Dairy Indemnity Payment Program. Under this program, when the government confiscates milk that's found to be contaminated, dairy farmers can apply to be indemnified. But the act asks for a little more information. First of all, if farmers used the contaminant that was found in the milk, they have to show that the contamination was not their fault. And then if they didn't use that contaminant, they still have to show that they didn't know about the presence of the contaminant or they couldn't have known. So here we're already asking for a little more information. Like, was the contamination somehow attributable to the actions of the farmer? And then after the first discovery of contamination, that program imposes an affirmative duty on farmers to basically take reasonable action to remove toxic substances from their facilities. I think that there are some lessons here for the LIP. We should be asking farmers whether there was anything they could have done to protect their animals, whether they share any responsibility for the deaths of their animals. And then also, after the first time they apply for assistance, maybe we could impose some kind of requirements and say, okay, now that you know that you're vulnerable to this kind of disaster, like, let's do something. If you're vulnerable to a power outage leading to a ventilation shutdown, let's ask next time whether you've purchased a generator and made provisions for backup power. Arts and Artifacts Indemnity Program. I want to spend some time talking about this because it's in kind of a totally different area, but I think it has some really cool ideas that we could think on. This program was passed by Congress in 1975 in response to the really expensive cost of insuring international art exhibitions. And there are some things in this program that the government has done to limit its financial liability. I will flag it's a little bit distinguishable just because under this program, museums are applying for indemnity in advance, whereas in the LIP, farmers are kind of covered and they apply for assistance after a disaster has happened. But one thing I think is interesting is that this program straight up says on the website that for reasons of risk, they're opposed to indemnifying more fragile items. I think you could draw a parallel between fragile art and animals that are kept in concentrated operations such that hundreds can die in one poorly disaster-proofed facility. The animals themselves are vulnerable and fragile, and also just the risk to the government in guaranteeing that we're indemnifying these losses is high. The next thing this program does is when an applicant applies for an indemnity agreement, they're asked to provide some information about the measures they're taking to protect their art. So what methods they're using to pack the art, the condition of it before and after transport, and also the maximum value of pieces contained in a single vehicle of transport. So again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, the government can ask these questions. What are you doing to protect your animals before we just write that blank check? So 3 years after the Arts and Artifacts Indemnity Program was passed, there was an application to indemnify an exhibit from East Germany, and the Federal Council made an agreement to indemnify up to $50 million, but they excluded from that agreement the value of 2/3 of the porcelains, and they only would cover 3/4 the value of panel paintings. So the National Endowment for the Humanities challenged this, and they argued that the act was intended for indemnity payments to cover the full value of exhibitions. The Office of Legal Counsel did not buy this argument, and they put out an opinion that said that the act doesn't require an indemnity agreement to cover the entire value of an exhibit, and that actually comes from their duty to protect the financial interests of the United States. That's baked into the statute in this case. Basically, the Federal Council can refuse to indemnify in the face of risk. They can indemnify fully, or they can just take an intermediate stance according to its own assessment of risk. So this is something to think on for the LIP, because again, when we know that natural disasters are a thing that happens, they're becoming more severe. Other industries are vulnerable to these organic incentives to adapt to climate risks. So we could just not indemnify at the same rate, depending on maybe if a factory farm, again, knows that they're vulnerable to flooding. Are they taking simple steps? Are we willing to pay them the same rate as a local farmer who's doing everything they can to protect their animals? So just incorporating, how do we take some of these cool ideas and how do we make them part of the LIP? As I flagged earlier, there is some language suggesting that assistance should be conditional on the exercise of normal preventative measures and good farming practices. It's empty now because we don't ask for information from farmers about what they've done, and we also don't define what normal preventative measures are and what good farming practices are. And I think a lot of us here are familiar with, this isn't the first time the federal government has just not defined animal care, animal raising standards. So let's start there. Let's define what that means. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. One place that we can look is FEMA. FEMA has published guidelines, practical advice to farmers for disaster mitigation. And they've got a lot of great ideas in there that I think are, again, practical. Installing sprinkler systems, consulting with local fire departments for disaster plans, backup generators, right? To prevent that ventilation shutdown problem we learned about earlier. So we can start to define it by looking to guidance that other agencies have already put out. And then once we have a definition, we can start asking farmers for information about what kind of good practices they've done when they apply for assistance. And then we can start to use that as a hook for limiting indemnity, kind of the same way that we do with the Arts and Artifacts Indemnity Program. Okay, so I think this is valuable because, again, we should have an organic incentive for people to adapt to climate risk. And on the whole, as a society, we want industries and individuals and businesses to start to adapt to climate risk. And we can help do this by saying the government is just not willing to take a risk on guaranteeing 75 or 50% indemnity for farms that aren't taking some common sense measures and just closing the barn doors. Okay, so that's my whole idea. Yeah. Well done. All right. Hi, everyone. Wave if you can hear me. Wave if you're still awake. All right, that's most of you. We'll take it. I'm gonna roam unless the booth tells me that I can't. If I stand over here, is that a problem? Okay. All right, so my name is Robin Burial. I am a third-year law student at McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento. And I wrote on the exact same thing that Chitska did. So I looked at the livestock indemnity program, and I wanted to figure out how can we use this existing program to save lives? Because as my colleagues have pointed out, right now, there's no incentive to save lives under this program. So the program began in 2008, so it's very new in terms of programs. There were some issues with the Farm Bill reauthorizations, largely related to cost. And so this is not something that has this long storied history in the United States such that we could not change it if we wanted to. The indemnity program covers adverse weather, disease, or attacks such as by wild animals. And as my colleagues have pointed out, it pays 75% of the animal's market value on the date of death. As law students and lawyers, we know that sometimes words can mean a lot of different things. So adverse weather has to be extreme or abnormal. So my question is, do we recalibrate that for our new world and climate change, or are we looking at what was considered normal when the program originally started in 2008? I think that's a fair question. They have clearly delineated which types of natural disasters will be covered and which are not. So I want to point out for those of you who are from the West, that it does not include drought as a natural disaster. Anybody in the West not think that drought is a natural disaster for us? Everybody still awake? Okay, so it doesn't include drought because there's a separate program that covers drought. Here we go. As again, my colleagues have pointed out, we are seeing more and more natural disasters. They are more intense, they are more severe. We are seeing greater losses, greater loss of life, greater loss of property. They are happening one right after another. So again, you'll have one hurricane and then a second hurricane before we've recovered. The US is spending $8 billion a year on agriculture insurance. That's $8 billion of taxpayer money that's going straight to the ag industry. For the LIP, in 2019, so pre-pandemic, we spent $58.5 million. And as again, my colleagues have pointed out, we often talk about loss in terms of dollars. So let's talk about what else that means. That means 1 million animal deaths. Eligibility for the Livestock Indemnity Program does not require mitigation or adaptation. So again, just to underscore what has already been said today, farms are not required to mitigate the effects of natural disasters, to adapt to climate change, to be eligible for this program. So how can we adapt the existing program to save lives and promote climate resiliency? For a threshold requirement, I am proposing that every farm, before they can apply for LIP funds, must file a disaster relief plan. Will every disaster relief plan always be followed? No, it will not, because that's how things work. But if you have to file a plan, the farms at least have to think about it, right? I have to think about, do I evacuate my livestock? Do I move them somewhere else? Do I set up generators? What is going to happen if I am faced with a wildfire or a hurricane or a flood? You have to think it through and file a disaster relief plan, or you are ineligible to participate in the Livestock Indemnity Program. Again, this is how I would like it to work and not how it currently works. How it currently works is you do not have to file a disaster relief plan. And then I propose we look at stackable or building block incentives that farms can mix and match based on what works for them. I'm also going to start with the bad news here, which is that the Livestock Indemnity Program, as it's currently set up, only covers farms with an adjusted gross income of $900,000 or less. So we are not going to hit most large CAFOs with the Livestock Indemnity Program. About 60% of farm production in the US is outside the scope of the LIP. So I just want to be very clear, changing this program is not going to solve the big problem, but it could save a lot of lives and I think is worth exploring. So again, in this dream world that I live in, we get a group together and it's not just big ag. We bring in the animal welfare people and we bring in the insurance people and we bring in people who have other sorts of concerns, environmentalists. Maybe we get somebody from the SEC to sit on the panel and we talk about what is it that farms can do to adapt to or mitigate climate change. So the list that I came up with here comes from suggestions of best practices. This would not be an inclusive list. This is me digging around on the internet and seeing what people have to say. But we need to tie specific measures that farms can take to a specific number, because we know that numbers are driving a lot of the decisions. So if your animals are properly identified on your farm, such that after a disaster, we can say which animals belong to which farm, or we can hopefully return the animals who maybe are moved to higher ground, we can return them to the proper farms, that's 5%. If you train your staff, this is what our disaster plan is, and here's how we're going to implement it, that's 10%. And farms can then stack incentives up to 90% of the value of their animals. We are incentivizing, you can get a higher reimbursement for an animal death if you take steps to prevent that animal's death. So we're going to look at a couple hypotheticals. The first one is laying hens in Georgia. So the animals that we're trying to protect here are chickens. Chickens have some special considerations, largely around temperature regulation, okay? And then litter management. Again, as my colleagues have pointed out, the waste products of an animal farm are a huge issue, particularly when you talk about any kind of flooding, because you mix all of the waste products and all of the water, and now we have a much, much bigger problem. We're in Georgia. Anybody here from the South? Yep. So what's our big problem in Georgia? It's hot, right? It's hot, it's humid, and we're at high risk of flooding in the area. So what a farm could do in Georgia, again, if this is our chart and we go through and we say, okay, what's going to help save the lives of chickens in Georgia? And the farm could say, okay, I'm going to train my staff. I'm going to install generators. So in case of a power loss, there is still feeding, temperature, and ventilation control systems. We're going to ensure that there are adequate cooling systems in the buildings where the chickens are kept. And what we're going to do outside of the animals themselves is decrease impermeable surfaces. So we're both addressing the risk to the animal and the risk from the climate disaster. We're going to stack all those incentives. And then if chickens die in a natural disaster, the farm can apply and get 80% per chicken as a reimbursement from the government. Second hypothetical, dairy cows in California. So we have a different animal to protect, but pretty similar concerns, right? So dairy cattle have milking needs. We can't just let the cow go without being milked because that can lead to infection and can lead to some pretty terrible outcomes for the cow. And so what does that look like if there's a power outage? What does that look like if people have to evacuate because there's a wildfire? And then again, just like with the chickens, manure and waste management becomes a very, very profound issue. We're in California. Any Californians in the room here today? Yes, we've got a few. Okay, what's our big issue in California? Fire. Absolutely. It's hot and it's getting hotter. We've got massive wildfires. And then drought. We're not going to talk about drought. Again, that's a separate program, but it's worth pointing out that there are some very serious concerns around water availability to farms as well. So this is our chart. Once again, the generic chart. The farm gets to look at the chart and the farm gets to say, I'm going to pick X, Y, and Z. And we want to give them some buy-in. So it's not the government is telling you this is what you have to do. The farm says, oh, well, I chose these 4 things. So now I have to make good on the 4 things that I chose. We've properly identified all of our dairy cattle. We've trained the staff. I've got the generators, the cooling systems. I've done some fuel reductions. I've created defensible barriers around my buildings. And then I went to the program and I said, you know what else would be helpful is if I switched to heat tolerant breeds of dairy cattle. So maybe instead of a cow that is gonna really suffer if the temperatures get above 100 degrees, I pick a cow that's a little bit more heat sturdy and I start transitioning my herd away from the more delicate flour to the hardier breed. And the LIP says, well, that makes sense to me. And we've stacked incentives to 90% here. So again, we have buy-in from the farm. We are working within the system that there already is. We are letting farms customize within reason what they're going to do. And the goal at the end of the day is to save as many animal lives as possible. So just to recap, we've got stackable incentives. We are going to increase the reimbursement cap. I know people probably feel some kind of way about that, but if we can get fewer deaths, we may be paying out the same amount of money for more lives saved or potentially less money in the future. And I also propose phasing it in. So it's like taxes where you can take a standardized deduction or you can take an itemized deduction and people get to choose, right? This would be, well, we're going to keep the 75% and do nothing. And we're going to sunset it in 5 years, or we're going to sunset it in 10 years. Meanwhile, we're going to roll out the adaptive LIP and we're going to let you choose. So you can take the standard LIP, or you can start making some changes now in anticipation of in the future being able to hit that 90% cap, because things do not change overnight. And then run the programs concurrently, let the farms choose, let them build towards making better choices. And then when the original LIP sunsets, then they either adapt or they don't get reimbursed for any losses they face. Again, our goal here is to save lives. We want to promote climate resiliency. We may want to transition to a plant-based diet in the future, decrease demand. I'm all for these changes. But in the meantime, while we have animals that are being kept on farms, let's do everything we can to incentivize humane treatment of those animals. Also, if we can align government spending, I think almost everybody who has talked today has talked about this. Tax dollars come from all of us. Do you want your money going towards a program where we shut the barn doors because I need to keep all of the livestock in the barn so I can count the carcasses? Or do we want the taxes to go towards, you know, we're going to transition you away from that program and towards something where you can make better choices?
And that is my presentation.
Thank you so much for those presentations. We have about 30 minutes for Q&A, so please come up to the microphones.
Thank you all. Okay, great. Thank you all. My name is Colleen. I'm a 2L at Yale Law School. I have a question for Chitska. Did I say your name right? Okay. And Robin, representing on the LIPs. So this seems like a pretty common sense and good proposal. I feel like this makes sense. What are the main political interests and also maybe procedural barriers that are preventing this from being,
Yes.
Great question.
Yeah, I think that's probably our biggest problem is the political climate because the agricultural lobby is just so powerful and there's a lot of money. The other problem is I think that the federal agencies themselves are not neutral. So they're kind of there to promote and assist the agricultural industry. I mean, if we look at the motives behind these agricultural assistance programs, it's to assist the agricultural industry, right? I mean, it's not, animal welfare is in no way built in. Even in the example I pointed out of the dairy indemnity payment program, their motive for asking whether contamination was a farmer's fault is not concern for the quality of food the cows are consuming. It's like food health safety, right? Things like that. So I think the political environment, the imbalance in lobbying power and political power, and then also just the hostility of federal agencies and rulemaking authorities themselves, the other challenges.
Yeah. I'm sorry, tell me your name again.
Colleen.
Okay, great question. In addition to everything that Chitska said, which I 100% agree with, the LIP is funded through the Farm Bill. And as we've seen over and over, the Farm Bill is very important. Both sides of the aisle have a huge stake in the Farm Bill. A large percentage of the Farm Bill is food stamps, right? So SNAP. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, not just OSNAP. Thanks. And so it becomes really contentious if we try to pull too hard on the LIP. Does that jeopardize food assistance for low-income families because then we can't pass the Farm Bill? And so that becomes a consideration in here as well as just not having the political will to do something like this. If we're still arguing in public about, is climate change real? It's very hard to say you have to adapt to climate change because it's happening right now. And so we just have some concerns about political discourse that make it really hard to make progress in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Sorry. My name is Almer Said. I'm an LLM and animal candidate at Lewis and Clark. So I have two questions, and I'm just trying to understand, if we break an ag farm in terms of the amount of money it has, for example, 9 million or bigger ag or small ag. So I heard about this, that there was talk about giving exceptions to small farmers when it comes to ESGs because they can't pay for it or something like that. I wanted to ask, would that somehow flow into the big ag as well because of the history of how this industry is? I know this is not a positive question. I'm sorry, just want to know. And on the other end, the LLPs, you mentioned that there's a cap that it only covers a certain amount of money that a farm basically has that come under its control, right?
I'm sorry. There's only a certain number of farms that come under the control of the LIP?
Yeah.
Correct.
So so breaking the whole ag in terms of the amount of money, the big ones, small ones. So this question also popped up in my head about the adaptations costs, basically who pays for it, and the taxpayer money. And you mentioned at the end that instead of us paying for the CAFOs, somehow this money could be diverted to this climate resilience plan. I wanted to know how would that happen? And the one other thing that I was, actually, I just forgot, so please your question, but sorry.
No problem. So I'm gonna take them kind of as I go, and then you tell me what I've missed, okay? All right, so the income cap on the LIP was set at $900,000 adjusted gross income for the farm, because I think there was some concern about why should taxpayer incentives go towards Cargill? Why should it go to Purdue? Why should it go to Tyson? When they're making profit hand over fist and not taking any sort of mitigation measures, plus all of the concerns that Jamie and Chiska have mentioned about growers not owning the chickens and that whole, CAFO thing of exporting all of your costs, right? So we've shown the LIP can be modified. We can put this income cap on it. We can restrict it to smaller farming operations. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting from my research is sometimes small farms put themselves at risk. So the farm and the people who work on the farm will not evacuate because I do not know how to evacuate my animals. So if we can get disaster plans in place, we can not only save animal lives, but we could potentially save human lives as well. So the income cap, how do we get CAFOs to follow along if we can get the small farms? Is that the gist of your question? Okay. So in my dream world where we implement something like this and the small farms start mitigating for climate change, does that trickle up to the CAFOs? Okay. So a couple of things. One, customary industry practices. If we can point to small farms and say customary industry practice is to provide proper ventilation, why are the big farms that have all the money not doing it? That gives us maybe a hook, maybe some leverage. Another thing that may be able to happen is conscious consumerism, where if people say, I don't want to buy from a company that isn't taking climate change seriously, then all of a sudden we've created a market for exactly this kind of mitigation, but that's going to have to be demand driven and not supply driven. I think it's a very complicated issue. How do we bring CAFOs in alignment with our values? And I'm willing to use any tool that I can get my hands on, whether that's getting the small farms to lead the way, or if that's leveraging, SEC regulations, or if that means that we, name and shame. Let's throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. What of your questions did I not address?
You actually addressed the gist of it. I mean, because I was interested in the adaptation cost, because these small farms, they could say that we just don't have the money to adapt. And you could use that as a hook to basically divert taxpayer money that we have to them instead of subsidizing CAFOs.
Yes, so a great question is how do we get the small farms to adapt? If I have to do fuels reduction or I have to decrease impermeable surfaces on my farm, how do I find the money to do that when I'm barely scraping by? That's a fair question, I think, right? And so then we look to, are there grant programs for this? If we're providing grant programs for small farm startups, are we providing grant programs for small farm maintenance? Which I think is again a question of, are we aligning our taxpayer spending with our values? It's not going to be easy, but I will say that if we don't do anything about climate change, as we have not done for the last, call it 60 years, we're really going to have some major problems, which we already do have. We're going to have even more major problems than we already do have. And so the money's got to come from somewhere. We can pay for the disasters or we can pay to start mitigating. It's just a question of how many lives do we have to lose before we start doing mitigation.
And I think there might have been a question there about ESG. I don't know.
What was the ESG question?
So I was reading about that there might be some exception given to small farmers when it comes to ESGs.
They won't need to report. So ESG is a metric for public companies. So if you have a security issuance that trades on a US exchange, small farmers don't typically, they don't decide to issue their own stock or anything like that. They're just small family farms. So it won't impact them. This is going to impact large companies. And as a side note, I was thinking earlier that I didn't address the fact that Many of the big ag companies that we talk about, they're not incorporated within the United States. They're often incorporated maybe in Brazil or Hong Kong or someplace like that. The great news is the first administrative action that the SEC brought against a company is Vale Mining. They are a Brazilian mining company and they issue American depository shares on the NYSE. That tells us that the SEC is going to go after these foreign companies if they have an issuance and they're not disclosing. So that's good news for us because we can target foreign companies that trade products here too.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Stuart Babcock. I'm a 2L at Yale Law. This is a question for Jamie. Yeah, I really appreciated kind of hearing about that, and I've been following that disclosure or that proposed rule by the SEC as well. I'm wondering, it seems like the long play there is something like, you get these companies kind of disclosing their emissions, you get some sort of public backlash, you ultimately get some change in there. I'm wondering if you can kind of spell out what you believe the connection might be, or if there's any potential downside, this public backlash related to emissions, and kind of what downstream effects that is going to have on animal welfare. And if that's going to increase or decrease animal welfare as companies try to get their emissions under control.
Yeah, so I don't see it as a way that would necessarily decrease animal welfare in any way, because anything that they do that's improper, that causes GHG emissions, they're going to have to report that. Now, when they omit it or they misreport any of these material factors, they can get sanctioned by the SEC. There's only been 3 suits brought so far, none against an animal company. The first one was Vale Mining, so that's good news for us because we know we can go after international folks. The second one was Bank of New York Mellon, and they didn't want to litigate with the SEC, so they settled and paid. And now it looks like they're going after Goldman Sachs. So there can only be positive outcomes, I see, because these companies are going to have to put their money where their mouth is. They don't want to like spend, it's not going to be like, $100,000 fine. It's going to be a huge fine if they've lied about their ESG metrics and they're, miscategorizing what they're doing. It might not, it's a trickle down kind of when it comes to animal welfare stuff, like you mentioned, because this is really attenuated. It's not direct. Because a lot of times in animal law, we think, okay, how could I go after these guys for animal cruelty, right? Let's use state animal cruelty laws. That's like really direct. This is not. So like I mentioned before, it's not just going after the environmental prong. We can go after the social prong and see how they're treating employees and stuff like that. The point is to hold their feet to the fire and make them spend their money on these things. And I would like to see the way that they contract with growers change as well, because those folks I see as victims, they don't want to treat animals like this. This is not really what they want. They go deep in debt trying to hold up their end of the bargain, and they often are just scraping by. They're not making a ton of money. If they had the ability to transition to do something else, they would, but this is maybe all they know. So it's difficult from that aspect. And I feel sorry for the growers that they're trapped in this horrific cycle where they're left on the hook for any environmental problems, but hopefully because, this is the SEC's rule and it's not something that's, enforced by the EPA, that it's going to be treated differently. And now instead of foisting everything on the growers that are down here, Big Ag is going to have to start taking some responsibility for what they're doing. I don't know if that answers your question completely, but.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah from the University of Chicago, and my question's for Jamie, a finance question. I just recently found out that as vegans, we don't just need to think about the food that we eat or the clothes that we buy, but even in personal investing. So I just recently found out that Tyson is one of the companies in the S&P 500. So if you invest in the biggest index fund, you're actually investing in them. And recently I've been seeing these small vegan ETFs popping up. I was wondering what your thoughts are on those and this kind of future of vegan securities.
So what is your question, whether or not to be investing in those companies?
Not for me myself, but I see that right now they are tiny and not very popular. Do you see kind of a big future for these things?
You mean for like investing in Tyson, like a future for sorry, did you say there was another security that you were talking about?
No, I just mean, do you think that these are gonna grow? Is there gonna be interest for this?
Oh, and ESG?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So this year, it's been in the last few years, one of the hottest places to put money. There's about $41 trillion worldwide in ESG right now. And by 2025, there's going to be $50 trillion. So this is why the SEC is cracking down on it, because there's been so much greenwashing and they've had no control over it. So, you know, and as far as like personal investing and stuff like that, I know that wasn't exactly your question. Sometimes there is this thought that, okay, we can go after a company like BlackRock. They issue ESG mutual funds. So that mutual fund has a lot of individual companies in them. And maybe there's not, those are not green or socially responsible companies that are in that mutual fund. And so the initial thought was, okay, well, let's pressure them to divest from those. And that, after giving it some more thought, that's really not the way to go. Because when you own those shares and you own a lot of them, like BlackRock does, what you can do is you can apply pressure to force change to that company. The minute you divest, you don't have any power, you know, over, you're not a shareholder anymore. You can't tell them what you want them to do. But just from a personal, you know, investment perspective too, that should be considered.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Daria Bednarczyk again from Vermont Law and Graduate School. And this is going back to the LIP and mitigation practices for future farming, especially on the CAFO level. Have you guys heard of anything maybe coming up within the next farm bill where we could do maybe mentorships, where we try to incorporate more female farmers and farmers from the BIPOC communities to essentially get partnered with an established farmer to make sure we have diversity within farming practices to kind of learn from one another, because everybody has a different style of farming that could be better or worse depending on your geographical location. But do you think by working together and incorporating more diversity into our farming industry, that could be a way to potentially change how farming practices are currently, I guess, working or not working?
Thanks, Daria.
Okay, that's a good question. It's something I hadn't thought about before. I think that I'm hesitant to think that, to be hopeful that a change like that could really make a material difference for animals and farms. But I think diversity of viewpoints is always a good thing, and having people in these industries that have a diversity of backgrounds and way that they're approaching issues. I think that about this like small farm, big farm conversation, there is something to say there, because concentrated operations are relatively new, and it's kind of like a thing we're watching happen, the consolidation of small farms into bigger operations, which I think is part of why changing the LIP is sort of an interesting proposal, because if we have small farms that suddenly aren't getting assistance, they're going to collapse, and we're going to see further concentration of animal operations. So I think to the extent that we can support diversity and good practices in smaller farms and help them start to reform and define what good farming practices should be, I don't see the harm.
I would add to that. Do you want to go ahead? Okay. I would add to that, you know, despite having diversity or not, I mean, that's a whole separate issue, because I believe that there are articles out there about the USDA, particularly like disenfranchising Black farmers and stuff in the South. So this is like a whole other topic. It's a huge problem. But just looking at small farming in general, you know, these folks are having a hard time doing anything because of the vertical integration problem. They might raise their own animals, but then where do they take them to get slaughtered? You know, Big Ag owns the slaughterhouses. The amount of slaughterhouses is shrinking, and they will only take either their own animals or large numbers of animals. So when a farmer wants to do things right and wants to have a small farm, they would have to like open their own slaughterhouse to be able to like actually slaughter their own animals, because there's just nowhere to take those animals because of the way that the industry is consolidated.
one of the changes from the original 2008 LIP to the version that we have today was to make Indigenous tribes available for LIP assistance on the farms that they have. So it certainly can be done. And I think there is a big push for incorporating a diversity of viewpoints, as well as reverting to just an acknowledgement that there were people long before colonists got to this land who were able to subsist in harmony with the environment and the animals therein. And that the changes that we've made with the concentrated farming and the consolidation of smaller farms into larger farms has really impacted the health of the planet and the health of the people and the animals that live on it. I do think that there is a push, particularly with like the SBA, the Small Business Association, to give grant funds to historically marginalized, historically excluded farmers, whether that's women farmers or queer farmers or farmers of color. How much of that is going to change what we've got is a very important question.
Wonderful, thank you, and good job.
Thanks.
One question, have there been studies into some of the costs associated with sort of upgrading or preventing against these types of potential harms to these animals? Does it make sort of dollars and cents for these either smaller or medium growers?
It's a great question. I'm not personally familiar with the studies, but I do know that the cost of mitigation is something that's constantly pointed to. So right now, there's no cost to not mitigate. I can still apply for LIP funds, right? If we take away, and my colleagues have talked about this today, if we take away the subsidies that discourage natural market forces from happening, then it starts to look a lot more feasible, right? If we take away subsidies for fossil fuel, suddenly renewable energy looks a lot more affordable, right? If we take away subsidies for CAFOs, if we take away subsidies for, shutting the barn doors, then suddenly mitigation doesn't look so expensive. But as long as there's a thumb on one side of the scale, it's very difficult to say, this thing looks super costly and you should go do it for moral reasons, when small farms are very much competing to not get swallowed up by these massive farming organizations.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then I think the other thing to think on when it comes to mitigation is farmers do have a goal with their farms. They're trying to raise their animals and bring them to slaughter, and that's an asset and that's their economical motive. And ideally, they would rather not have all their animals die in a natural disaster. They're still only getting compensated at 75% of the fair market value. So I think that sometimes the cost of mitigation is just like a political argument. And some of the fixes aren't that expensive, in my opinion. I think things like sprinkler systems and generators are totally feasible for farms. And I can't talk dollars and cents. So.
Any other questions? Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.